A man is kneeling beside a dying body in the dirt between two sal trees near a small town called Kusinara that you have probably never heard of and never will visit. He is old now. His hands shake a little when he reaches out and pull back because he has never once in 45 years touched this particular body without being given permission first. Tonight, permission doesn't seem to matter anymore. The body is breathing in long, spaced out pulls like a tide going out for the last time. His name is Ananda, and for 45 years he has been the closest person on earth to the man lying in front of him. He has poured his water. He has fanned him in the heat. He has remembered, word for word, almost every single thing the man has ever said public, because that has been his job, to remember, so that nothing would be lost. He has done this job better than anyone in the history of the world has ever done a job like it. But there is one question he has never asked. 45 years, and he never asked it. 'Cause you don't ask a man like this what it felt like to be afraid. You don't ask him whether his hands shook. You assume, if you even let yourself think about it at all, that for him there was never any shaking to begin with. That the hardest night of his life must have looked from the inside exactly the way it looks on the outside of every painted wall and carved stone you've ever seen of it. Calm, lit gold, inevitable. Ananda is about to lose the only chance he will ever have to ask. And so in the dirt, between two trees, he leans down and he finally says the thing he has swallowed for almost half a century. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs only to the people who serve quietly for decades beside someone the rest of the world considers larger than life. Ananda has spent his entire adult existence in that position, not as a disciple seeking his own understanding first, though that understanding came to him too, eventually, but as the steady hand that made everything else possible. He carried water before anyone asked for it. He noticed, before almost anyone else in the community noticed, when the teacher was tired. Then, a visitor's question was going to require more patience than the visitor themselves understood they were asking for. When a quiet word needed to be said to smooth over a dispute before it grew into something larger. None of that work shows up in any of the famous sermons. It rarely shows up in any telling of this story at all, and yet without it, decades of teaching simply could not have happened the way they happened. That kind of constant, careful attention to someone else's needs has a way of making your own questions feel, by comparison, embarrassingly small. What right did he have? Ananda must have thought more times than he could count. To ask about something as personal as fear when there was always a more practical task waiting. A robe to mend, a meal to arrange, a traveler at the gate needing direction. And so decade after decade, the question waited, the way important questions often do, crowded out by the constant, reasonable-seeming urgency of everything else. What was it actually like? In there, that whole night, alone. We are going to leave him there for a moment. Kneeling in the dark, waiting for an answer he is not sure is still coming. Hold that question. We will come back to it, but not yet, because to understand the answer, you have to go back 45 years yourself, to a riverbank 200 miles away, on a particular evening, under a particular tree, on the night before a particular full moon. Here's what most people get wrong about this night. They think of it as a single flash. One moment, a man sitting in the dark, confused, suffering just like the rest of us. The next moment, light, understanding, a halo more or less, as if the hardest, longest, most demanding night of effort any human being has ever undertaken happened the way a candle gets lit. One strike, done. It did not happen that way. And if you take nothing else from this story, take this, it happened the long way. Now, hour by hour, fear by fear. The way anything real happens, so let's go back, let's actually sit with him. The river is called the Niranjana, and on this particular evening it is running low and clear, the way rivers run at the end of the dry season, before the real heat of summer breaks. A man is walking along its bank. He is not dressed like a prince, although he was born one. He is not dressed like a beggar either, although for the better part of 6 years that is closer to what he has been. His robe is the color of old leaves. His body, if you saw it in full daylight, would alarm you. Not because it is wounded, but because it is so thin you could count almost every bone beneath the skin. The legacy of starving himself nearly to death, trying to find an answer that starving did not, in the end, contain. His name at this point in the story is still Siddhartha Gautama, not yet the Buddha, not yet the Tathagata, just a man alone on a riverbank looking for a place to sit down. You have had nights like this, maybe not on a riverbank, maybe in a parked car, or a bedroom at 3 in the morning, or a hospital waiting room with bad lighting and a vending machine that doesn't work. But you know the feeling of having run out of moves. You know what it is to have tried every strategy you can think of and to still be standing there, at the end of all your strategies, with the problem fully intact. That is roughly where Siddhartha is standing, on this riverbank, on this particular evening. 6 years of searching, 2 famous teachers studied and outgrown, a body nearly destroyed trying to starve the suffering out of himself, and the suffering is still there, untouched, waiting. He finds a tree. It is a fig tree, what later generations will simply call the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, though on this particular evening it is just a fig tree, broad-leafed, with roots thick enough to sit against. He walks a slow circle around its base. Then he gathers a heap of grass someone has cut nearby, arranges it facing east, toward the direction the sun will rise from in a few hours, and sits down. It's worth knowing, since the tree itself is going to matter more and more as this story unfolds. Exactly what kind of tree this actually was, botanically speaking, separate from anything mythic later generations would attach to it. And it belongs to the fig family, what botanists today would classify as Ficus religiosa, a species that grows readily across the Indian subcontinent, recognizable by its distinctive heart-shaped leaves that taper into a long, elegant point, and by an extensive root system capable of supporting an enormous, long-lived canopy. None of that was special on this particular evening. There were almost certainly other fig trees of the same species scattered throughout that same stretch of forest, equally broad, equally capable of providing shade and shelter to anyone who needed it. And what made this one different was not its biology. It was simply the one tree among countless similar trees that one exhausted, determined man happened to choose on one particular evening as the place he intended to stop running for good. And then he says something to himself, not out loud, not for an audience, just a private vow made the way you make a promise to yourself when you have finally had enough. Even if my skin and nerves and bones dry up and my blood and flesh wither away, I will not move from this seat until I have understood. Notice what he does not do. He does not pray to be rescued. He does not ask for a sign. He does not bargain. He simply sets his body down in one place and decides not to negotiate with himself about leaving it. There is a meaningful difference, worth naming directly, between a vow made out of desperation and a vow made out of clarity, even though from the outside the two can look almost identical. A desperate vow tends to come with conditions attached, even unspoken ones. A quiet hope that the universe will notice the sacrifice and reward it quickly. A private expectation that surely this much commitment deserves a swift answer. This vow, as the texts describe it, carries no such expectation. He is not bargaining for a result on any particular timeline. He has simply run out of every other option available to him and has decided, with whatever clarity 6 years of failure can produce, that the only thing left worth trying is to stop running entirely for as long as it takes, with no guarantee built in that it will take any particular length of time at all. This is not a story about a god descending to fix a broken world. This is not a story about a miracle arriving by surprise, the way lightning arrives uninvited from somewhere outside. This is not a story about luck, about one man getting handed something the rest of us could never reach. This is a story about a man who finally stopped running and who discovered the hard way, over the course of one extremely long night, what is actually on the other side of stopping. Stay with him a little longer, because the sun has not even fully set yet. Nothing happened. He is just a thin man, sitting cross-legged under a tree, facing east, breathing. But here's the thing about sitting completely still, with nothing left to distract yourself with, no plan, no escape route, no next move. It does not stay quiet for long. The mind, when you finally stop feeding it new problems to chase, does not go peacefully blank. It goes looking through the back rooms. It starts pulling out everything you've avoided looking at directly for years. Old griefs, old fears, the exact memory you flinch away from on ordinary days, because ordinary days give you 1,000 ways to flinch. Siddhartha has removed every one of those 1,000 ways. He has nowhere left to look but in. You know this feeling, even if you have never sat under a tree for an entire night in your life. You know what happens in the first 10 minutes of trying to fall asleep when you are genuinely upset about something. How the thought you've been out running all day finally catches up with you the second you stop moving. Now, multiply that by an entire night, by years of things never looked at, by the specific, terrible clarity of a man who has decided this time not to get up and make tea, not to check his phone, not to find some small task to interrupt the feeling with. He has nowhere to go, and something has noticed. Picture the actual texture of it for a moment, because it is worth picturing rather than skimming past. The bark of the fig tree at his back, still warm from a full day of sun beginning to cool. The particular smell of a riverbank at dusk in that part of the world. Wet mud, crushed grass, a faint mineral tang of water that has been running over the same stones for longer than anyone can remember. Insects starting their evening chorus in the underbrush, a kind of sound that fills a forest so completely you stop noticing it within minutes, the way you stop noticing your own breathing. None of it dramatic, none of it announcing that anything unusual is about to happen. Just an ordinary evening, settling in around one extraordinarily determined man. And underneath that ordinary evening, something else is beginning to stir that has nothing to do with insects or cooling bark. You have to understand what 6 years of this kind of searching actually does to a person's inner life before you can understand what's about to surface in him. 6 years is not a metaphorical span of time. It is 2,000 mornings of waking up, still searching. It is countless nights of falling asleep with the same unanswered question pressing against the inside of his skull. It is a body deliberately starved past the point most people would call dangerous, in the conviction common enough among ascetics of his era that depriving the flesh might somehow starve the suffering along with it. It didn't, and he already knows that by this point in the story. That particular door closed weeks ago, the night he finally admitted that a body too weak to think clearly was never going to produce the clarity he was looking for. What's left, after 6 years of every other approach has been tried and found wanting, is something almost embarrassingly simple. Sit down and stop running. But stop running is a phrase that sounds easy precisely because it doesn't tell you what you're actually going to encounter once the running finally stops. And what fills the silence first, for almost anyone who has ever genuinely tried this, not for an afternoon but for real with nowhere else to go, is rarely peace. It is far more often the accumulated backlog of every feeling you've been too busy, not too distracted or too frightened to fully feel. Here's where the silence turns into something else, because in the old language of this story, in Pali, there is a name for the force that arrives in exactly that gap, the gap between deciding to stay still and actually managing to stay still. It is called Māra. You will hear that name many more times before this night is over. So it is worth understanding now before he arrives in full. Māra is not, in the oldest and most honest tellings, a red-skinned demon with horns, the way later paintings will draw him. Māra is something closer to the personification of every reason you have ever found, in the dark, at the worst possible moment, to get back up and walk away from the thing you said you would finish. Fear wears his face. So does boredom, so does doubt, so strangely does desire, the small urgent voice that tells all you that surely there's something more comfortable you could be doing with this particular hour of your one life. And on this particular evening, as the light over the Niranjana turns from gold to bruised purple to the deep blue that comes right before full dark, that voice is just beginning to stir somewhere in the trees behind him. The way you can feel a storm before you can see it. Something is gathering. Something has been watching this man on and off for years, the way you watch a fire you suspect might finally catch. And tonight, for the first time, conditions are right. Keep this in mind. It matters later tonight when that gathering stops being a feeling in the trees and becomes something with daughters, an army, and a voice of its own. But for now, the sun finishes setting. The full moon of the month the old texts call Vaisakha, what you might know better today as the May full moon, begins its slow climb over the eastern hills. The same direction Siddhartha is facing. The same direction, hours from now, the dawn itself will come from. He has chosen his seat without knowing it would line up so exactly with the night's whole arc, light to dark to light again. Or maybe, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, maybe it was never an accident at all. Maybe some part of him, after 6 years of searching, already understood that this was the night, even before the first hour of it had started. He does not move. The grass beneath him is still cool from the day. A few birds finish their evening business in the branches overhead and go quiet. Somewhere downstream, a woman named Sujata, who has no idea yet that she will be remembered for thousands of years for one act of ordinary kindness, is finishing the last of her evening chores, completely unaware that the most important breakfast in the history of her village is the one she is going to prepare by accident in just a few hours. We'll meet her properly very soon. For now, hold this image. One man, sitting alone in failing light facing east, having just made a promise to himself that he intends for the first time in his life to actually keep. The river moving past him, low and quiet, the moon rising behind the hills, none. And somewhere in the dark beyond the firelight he doesn't have, something old and patient, and very interested in whether tonight is going to be different, beginning slowly to take notice. Centuries later, people are still standing exactly where this happened. They travel from every part of the world to stand under a tree that is, in fact, a direct descendant of this exact tree, grown from a cutting of a cutting of a cutting, still rooted in the same patch of ground beside the same slow river. We are going to walk that long thread all the way to the present day before this story is finished. But first, you need to understand what that man, on that particular evening, was actually walking away from to get here, and what exactly was about to walk toward him out of the dark. By now, you've watched one tired, half-starved man sit down under a fig tree and make a promise to himself he has no idea yet how hard it will be to keep. But to understand what brought him to that exact riverbank on that exact evening, you have to go back further. And you also need to meet the woman who, completely without meaning to, gave him just enough strength in his body to survive the night that was coming. Her name is Sujata. She lives in a small village called Senanigama, close enough to the river that you could walk it in under an hour. She is not a renunciate. She is not a seeker. She is, by every account that survives her, simply a kind woman who has made a vow of her own, a much smaller, much more domestic vow than the one Siddhartha is making at almost exactly the same moment a short distance away. It's worth pausing on Sujata for a moment longer than most retellings allow, because her entire role in this story, decisive as it turns out to be, comes from a life lived entirely outside the world of seekers, teachers, ascetic competition you've just spent a chapter learning about. She would not have known the names Kalama or Udaka, and she would not have known the specific philosophical disputes dividing the wandering teachers scattered through the forests near her village. Her concerns were the concerns of an ordinary household in an ordinary village, a harvest, a husband, a child she had wanted badly enough to make a vow about it to whatever spirit she believed presided over the tree near her home. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the single most important meal in this entire story was prepared not by anyone seeking enlightenment, not by any disciple or devotee, but by a woman simply keeping a promise she had made years earlier for entirely personal, entirely unspiritual reasons. The sacred and the ordinary in this story keep turning out to be far less separate from each other than you might expect. Years earlier, when she wanted a child, she promised the spirit of a particular tree that if her wish was granted, she would return every year and make an offering of milk rice, the richest, most carefully prepared food a village household could produce. Her wish was granted. And on this particular morning, yes, we are circling back slightly, to the morning before the evening you already know, because this story keeps doubling back on itself the way memory does. She sends her servant ahead to the tree to sweep the ground and prepare the offering, and the servant comes running back with wide eyes, insisting that the tree spirit has finally appeared in person to receive the gift. What the servant actually saw, of course, was not a spirit, it was a man. Thin almost beyond recognition, sitting very still, very close to where the offering is meant to be left, looking to a frightened servant's eyes in the half-light, like nothing she has ever seen a human being look like before. Sujata does not ask too many questions. She fills a golden bowl with milk rice, cooked with more care than she has ever put into a meal in her life, and she carries it to him herself. And here is the detail that almost nobody tells you, the detail historians and storytellers across 2,500 years have kept circling back to. She does not just hand him the bowl. And, according to the oldest layer of legend around this moment, she also says something like, "May your wish be granted the way mine was," and then asks him to do one more thing before he eats. "Take the bowl down to the river's edge," and she tells him. "And after you've eaten from it, set it on the water. If your wish is going to come true tonight, the bowl will float upstream." This is the kind of detail you almost want to argue with, because it sounds, on its face, like the kind of thing storytellers invent later to dress up a plain historical fact with a little magic. Maybe it is exactly that. But hold on to the image anyway, because we are coming back to it. A golden bowl, set deliberately against the current, asked to do the one thing water never does on its own. It's worth noting where this particular detail actually sits within the broader textual tradition, because not every detail in this story carries the same historical weight. The core elements of this night, the vow, the confrontation, the three knowledges, the dawn, appear consistently across the very earliest layers of the Pali Canon. The texts scholars generally treat as closest to whatever was actually remembered and transmitted in the first generations after these events. The golden bowl and its journey upstream belongs to a slightly later layer, the commentarial and narrative tradition that grew up around the core texts in the centuries that followed, filling in biographical detail the earliest suttas themselves don't dwell on. That doesn't make the detail false. Exactly. Oral traditions carry real information forward in ways that don't always survive in the earliest written layer. And a detail this specific preserved this consistently across multiple independent commentarial traditions may well be reaching back toward something genuinely remembered. But it's worth being honest about the difference between the parts of this story resting on the oldest, most carefully preserved layer of testimony, and the parts that arrived later, dressed in the kind of vivid, memorable detail that helps an oral tradition travel further and survive longer. He eats. It is by every account, the first real food he has taken in this concentrated a quantity in longer than he can remember. After years of steadily reducing what he allowed himself down to a handful of grain a day, then less, trying to starve his way to an answer his body could no longer carry him toward. He eats it slowly. It is almost certainly the single most important meal in the history of his life, though no one standing there, not Sujata, not her startled servant, has any idea what they are actually witnessing. And then he carries the bowl to the river and sets it down on the surface of the water. It floats upstream. We are not going to pretend to explain that, and we are simply going to note that every version of this story that has survived across every tradition, every language, every century of retelling insists on this detail and asks you to keep it in your mind the way you'd keep a strange dream in your mind the next morning. Not fully believed, not fully dismissed, just carried along, waiting to mean something later. There's a detail here easy to miss in all of this. The man eating that rice on the morning of the most important night of his life was once a prince. Not a poor man who clawed his way toward greatness. A prince raised inside walls specifically built, according to the story his own family told about him before he was even born, to keep every form of suffering out. You need to understand what he actually walked away from, because it changes what stopping meant for him. It wasn't the relief of a tired man finally putting down a heavy bag. It was the willful abandonment of every comfort a human being is supposed to want. Picture the palace first, and soft floors. Music at every hour he wanted it. A wife, Yasodhara, who loved him in the plain, unglamorous way real people love each other. Not the way it gets painted later, all golden light and no friction, but the real way, with disagreements and tenderness both. And a son, Rahula. Born only days by most tellings before Siddhartha made the decision that would define the rest of both their lives. Now, it's worth resisting the urge most retellings give in to here, which is to flatten Yasodhara into a passive figure waiting quietly in the background of someone else's story. The traditions that center her own perspective, composed later, and far less widely circulated than the accounts focused on Siddhartha himself, but preserved nonetheless, describe a marriage built on genuine partnership. Two people raised together from childhood in the same court, who chose each other, by some versions of the story, through a series of contests Siddhartha had to win against other suitors. She is remembered, in these accounts, not simply as someone who was left, but as someone who, upon learning what had happened, made her own deliberate choice afterward, to adopt much of the same austerity her husband had taken up in the forest, sleeping on hard floors, eating simply, raising their son largely alone in a household that had every comfort available and chose, out of solidarity with a man who was no longer there to ask it of her, not to use most of it. Whatever this story becomes in the chapters ahead, it is worth remembering that the cost of that one decision, made in the dark in a single room, was carried for years afterward by people who never got the chance to understand, real time, exactly why it had to be made this way. He left at night. There's no softening that detail, and we're not going to try. He went to the room where Yasodhara lay asleep with the infant Rahula curled against her, and, according to the oldest accounts, he stood in the doorway for a long moment, wanting badly to hold his son one final time, and then made himself turn away, afraid that if he woke her, if he picked up that small sleeping body even once, he would never find the will to leave. This is not a comfortable detail. It is not supposed to be. Whatever this story becomes by the end, and it becomes something enormous. It starts with a father walking away from a sleeping child in the dark, convinced that some larger debt to every suffering being on earth outweighed the smaller, fiercer debt he owed the two people sleeping in that one room. It would be easy and dishonest not to resolve this tension too quickly by insisting that everything worked out fine in the end, that the eventual scale of what he accomplished somehow settles the moral weight of that one departure. The texts themselves don't take that easy way out. Years later, when Rahula is old enough, he becomes one of his father's own students, eventually fully ordained into the same community his father founded. A reunion the tradition clearly treats as significant, even moving. But a reunion years later does not erase a childhood spent without a father present for any of it, and nothing in the surviving record suggests the tradition wanted you to pretend otherwise. This story asks you to hold both things at once, a decision that, by its own internal logic, may have been necessary for what eventually came of it, and a cost paid by two specific people who never asked to pay it, that the story does not pretend was small. He called for his charioteer, a man named Channa, who had served him since they were both boys and who, more than anyone else outside the family, understood exactly what was being asked of him that night. Saddle the horse and tell no one. Channa's role in this story rarely gets the attention it deserves, mostly because his part in it ends here, on this single night, and the texts move on quickly to the more dramatic events of the search itself. But consider for a moment exactly what was being asked of him. Not simply a practical favor saddling a horse in the dark, and he was being asked to become complicit in the disappearance of the kingdom's heir, to betray the trust of a king who had raised him alongside his own son, to risk whatever punishment a furious and grieving father might eventually decide to hand down once the morning revealed what had happened. Channa did it anyway. Apparently without serious hesitation, nothing more than the strength of a lifelong friendship and a sense the texts suggest that whatever was driving Siddhartha that night deserved to be honored rather than blocked. He would go on, years later, to actually meet the Buddha again as a member of his community. One of the very few people from this opening night of departure who reappears decades on in the story of what came after. The horse's name was Kangtaka, according to the legend that grew up around this moment, and we'll tell you plainly that this is legend, not history. The kind of detail that accumulates around a story once people have decided it's important enough to deserve embellishment. The horse's hooves made no sound on the cobblestones as they rode out, because unseen hands were lifting them, one by one, so the sleeping guards wouldn't wake. Channa rode with him to the edge of his father's kingdom, and there, at a river very different from the one we started this chapter beside, Siddhartha took off his prince's robes, cut his own hair with a sword, and handed Channa the reins, the jewelry, everything that marked him as royalty, and sent him home alone. Kantaka, the story says, died of grief on the journey back, unable to bear separation from the man it had carried out of the only life either of them had known. Whether or not every detail of that ride happened exactly as the texts describe it, the shape of it is not in dispute. A man with everything walked into a forest with nothing on purpose, not because he had become convinced that everything he had wasn't going to be enough to solve the one problem he actually cared about. That problem had a name, even back then, even before he had any real understanding of it. Suffering, not his own suffering specifically. He'd had remarkably little of that, growing up inside walls built to keep it out. But the suffering he'd glimpsed on the few occasions he'd been allowed outside those walls. An old man, bent and trembling, a sick man shaking with fever, a corpse being carried to the burning ground. 3 sights, the old story says, that cracked something open in him that the palace could never quite seal back shut, and it's worth sitting with those 3 sights a little longer than the old tellings usually allow, because the palace he grew up in had been built, quite deliberately, to make sure he never saw any of them. His father, the story goes, had been warned by a wandering sage shortly after the boy's birth that this particular child would grow up to become either a great ruler or a great renunciate, depending entirely on what he was exposed to. A ruler needed by his side, not a son wandering off into the forest. The king did everything in his power to weight the scales, surrounded the boy with music, with beauty, with the carefully managed appearance of a world that contained no aging, no sickness, no death at all. Servants were instructed by some versions of the story to keep anyone visibly old or unwell away from the prince's path entirely. For years it worked. He grew up believing, in some unquestioned way, most of us never have to question because most of us never get the chance to grow up quite this sheltered. that perhaps suffering was something that happened to other people in other places, for reasons that didn't apply to him. The four sights, the fourth being a calm, contented ascetic walking past him on the road, looking more at peace than anyone he had ever met inside the palace walls, broke that illusion completely, and broke it fast, the way a held breath breaks the instant you finally have to gasp for air. Aging was not something that happened to other people. It was happening slowly to everyone he loved, including eventually himself. Sickness was not a rumor, death was not a story. And somewhere in the gap between those three terrifying certainties and that fourth man's unexplainable calm, a question took root in him that the rest of his life would be organized around answering. If all of this is true, if everyone I love is aging, sickening, and dying with no exception and no escape, how is it possible for anyone to be at peace? 6 years passed between that night and the night we're actually telling you about, the night under the fig tree by the Niranjana. 6 years of searching, failing, studying with teachers, outgrowing them, and starving himself nearly to death, and finding at the end of every single strategy that the suffering was still there, fully intact, waiting for him exactly where he'd left it. Which brings us back to the golden bowl, floating upstream on a river that should have carried it the other way. If this story tracks anything at all, it tracks this: the rules are about to bend. Something that has never happened before is about to happen to a man who has tried everything a human being can try and is now down to the one thing he hasn't tried yet: staying still and letting whatever needs to surface. Here's what most people get wrong about what comes next, though, and it's worth saying clearly before we go any further. They assume that because the hardest part, the leaving, the searching, the starving, is already behind him, the rest of the night must be easier by comparison. It is not. In some ways, what's coming is harder than anything he's faced yet, because for the first time in 6 years, he has nowhere left to run to. No new teacher to find. No stricter fast to attempt, no further sacrifice to make. Just a man, a tree, a rising moon, and whatever is waiting in the dark behind him. If this story is landing for you so far, if you're the kind of person who likes sitting with old, true things long enough to actually feel them, rather than skimming past them, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribing helps more people find stories told this way, slowly, the way they actually happened. And here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we go on. When was the last time you had absolutely nowhere left to run to? No next strategy, no new plan, nothing left but to sit with whatever was actually there. Tell me about it below. I read everyone. Now go back to the tree. The moon is climbing, the food is in him. The bowl is doing something it shouldn't be able to do. And somewhere behind him, in the deepening dark beneath the branches, something has finally decided that tonight it can wait no longer. By now you've watched a starving prince eat the richest meal of his life, set a bowl on a river that bent its own rules for him, and walk, in memory, backward through 6 years, away from a sleeping wife and son toward this exact tree. Now it's time to come back to the present moment of the night itself, because the light is almost gone, and something in the forest has stopped being a feeling and started being a presence. The sun finishes its drop behind the western hills. For a few minutes, the sky over the Niranjana does the thing skies do at this time of year in this part of the world. Turns the color of a fresh bruise, deep violet shading into a red so dark it's almost brown, and then, all at once, simply gives up and goes black. The moon, full and low, climbs in the east, exactly where Siddhartha is facing, exactly where the sun will rise again in a handful of hours. He has not moved. This matters more than it sounds like it should. Sitting still, physically, for an hour is not hard. Most of you have done it without noticing, hunched over a desk, lost in a screen. But sitting still on purpose, with nowhere to look but inward, with no task to disappear into for hour after hour, while every nerve in your body slowly remembers it would very much like to move. That is a different kind of stillness altogether, and it is the kind he has vowed to keep until something changes. And this part of the story takes place in a kingdom you should know a little about, because it sets the stage, geographically and politically, for everything that follows in the years after this night. The land here belongs to Magadha, ruled at this time by a young king named Bhūmisparśa, a king who, within a handful of years, will become one of Siddhartha's most devoted supporters, who will offer him land for a monastery, who will, in his own way, help carry this story out into the wider world once it's ready to travel. This was, historically speaking, an unusually fertile moment for exactly this kind of search to be taking place, and the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era saw an extraordinary flowering of new religious and philosophical movements across the Ganges plain, a period later scholars would sometimes compare, in spirit if not in detail, other great ages of intellectual ferment elsewhere in the ancient world. Established Vedic ritual traditions were being questioned openly by wandering teachers of every description, materialists who denied any survival after death at all, fatalists who taught that every event was already fixed beyond any possibility of change, extreme ascetics convinced that radical self-denial alone could purchase liberation, and skeptics who refused to commit to any position whatsoever on the grounds that certainty itself was the problem. Siddhartha's own search did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside this same churning marketplace of competing answers, surrounded by serious people offering serious, mutually contradictory accounts of how suffering worked and what, if anything, could be done about it. Two of those serious people, Kalama and Udaka, you've already met, and you'll meet the broader texture of that world again later tonight, when 5 other seekers from that same churning marketplace watch him approach a deer park near Sarnath, unconvinced that he has anything new to offer them at all. Tonight Bhūmisparśa knows nothing of any of this, and he is asleep in a palace less than a day's journey from where a thin, robeless man sits under a fig tree on the edge of his kingdom, about to become more historically significant than every king who will ever rule that land combined. And it's worth pausing for a moment on just how unremarkable this stretch of countryside would have looked to anyone passing through it that particular evening. And northern India in this era was a patchwork of small kingdoms and republics, the Magadha region one of several competing for influence along the fertile plain of the Ganges basin. A landscape of rice paddies, scattered villages, market towns connected by dusty trade roads, and long stretches of forest where wandering ascetics of every description set up camp, drawn by the same reputation for spiritual seriousness that had drawn Siddhartha here years earlier. There was nothing in the landscape itself to mark this particular fig tree as different from 1,000 others scattered across the same forest. No shrine yet. No worn path of pilgrims' feet. Just a tree, a riverbank, and a man who had chosen this exact spot for reasons that had more to do with the quality of the silence than anything visibly sacred about the ground. Here's the part the texts agree on, almost word for word, regardless of which ancient language you read them in. Pali, Sanskrit, the Chinese translations made centuries later. The accounts carried orally long before anyone wrote any of it down. Something noticed him. Something had, in fact, been noticing him for years, the way you notice a fire that keeps almost catching. And tonight, for reasons the texts attribute to the depth of his vow and the firmness of his resolve, the watching turned into approaching. And the old language gives this presence a name, Māra. It is worth pausing here properly to understand what that name actually means and what it doesn't, because almost every modern retelling gets this wrong in one direction or the other. Some flatten Māra into a cartoon, a devil with horns, a special effect, something you can dismiss the way you'd dismiss a ghost story. Others spiritualize him into pure abstraction, a tidy metaphor with no teeth, no menace, nothing that should actually frighten you. Neither version does justice to what the oldest texts are actually describing. Māra literally means something close to the killer, or the one who brings death. Not always physical death, but the death of possibility, the death of resolve, the death of the version of yourself that was 10 minutes ago brave enough to sit still and find out what happens. In the earliest layers of the tradition, Māra is treated as genuinely real, an actual being, a kind of cosmic tempter whose entire function, across countless other stories scattered through the canon, is to find whoever is closest to breaking free of suffering and do everything in his power to keep them exactly where they are. This is not the only confrontation between Siddhartha and this particular figure recorded across the texts, by the way. The Samyutta Nikaya preserves a whole series of shorter exchanges, scattered across different points in his later life, where Māra reappears, usually attempting some smaller, subtler version of the same basic strategy, and usually recognized and dismissed within a few lines of dialogue. What makes tonight's confrontation different from all of those later, smaller ones, is simply the stakes involved. In every later appearance, Māra is attempting to unsettle someone who is already broken free. Tonight, he is attempting to prevent that breaking free from happening at all, which is presumably why tonight's version of him arrives with daughters, with an army, with every weapon at his disposal, rather than the single quiet remark that seems to satisfy him in most of his later, far less consequential appearances. But here's the detail that should make the hair stand up on your arms a little, the detail that turns this from an old myth into something uncomfortably close to your own life. Even read at the most literal, most supernatural level, every single thing Māra is described as bringing on this particular night is something you have met yourself. Fear, doubt, desire, boredom, the specific itchy, restless conviction that surely there's something better to be doing with this hour than sitting here doing nothing at all. This is not a metaphor. Sit with that for a second before we move on. Whatever Māra is, a being, a force, aim for something psychological that the old storytellers chose to dramatize as a character. What he represents is not exotic. It is the most familiar thing in the world. It is every reason you have ever found, at the worst possible moment, to get up and walk away from the thing you said you'd finish. And on this particular night, in this particular forest, he has finally found the conditions he's been waiting for. And according to the Padana Sutta, one of the oldest surviving accounts of this confrontation, Māra approaches first not with threats but with something gentler, almost kind. The suggestion that Siddhartha has already done enough. You are thin, you are weak. You have given 6 years to this search and found nothing. Why not get up, return to your kingdom, rule well, do good in the world the way a powerful, comfortable man can do good, and let this particular obsession go. Notice what's actually being offered here, because it is not a crude temptation. It is in some ways the most reasonable argument anyone makes to him all night. Comfort, usefulness, a graceful, even noble exit from a search that has already cost him almost everything. And if you have ever talked yourself out of something difficult by convincing yourself that the easier path was actually the wiser one, and almost everyone has, at some point you already know exactly how persuasive this voice can be. There's a particular cruelty embedded in how reasonable this first offer sounds, worth naming directly. Māra is not asking him to abandon his values. He is asking him to fulfill different ones. The value of being useful, the value of relieving suffering at scale, the value of taking responsibility for a kingdom that genuinely needs a wise and compassionate ruler. None of those values are false or unworthy on their own terms. A version of Siddhartha that returned to the palace and ruled with genuine wisdom and compassion would have done real measurable good in the world by any reasonable standard available at the time. That is precisely what makes this opening move so much harder to refuse cleanly than a cruder temptation would have been. It does not require him to betray what he cares about, and it only requires him to settle for a smaller, more achievable version of it. The exact maneuver that talks so many sincere people in every era out of the harder, less certain thing they originally set out to do, in favor of a more comfortable good they already know how to accomplish. Siddhartha does not answer with anger. According to the texts, he answers with something closer to recognition. I know you, Māra. I see exactly what you're doing. And the offer refused doesn't end the conversation. It only ends the opening move. Here's the part most retellings skip past too quickly, eager to get to the dramatic part with armies and monsters. This first approach, the quiet, reasonable one, is in some ways the most dangerous thing that happens to him all night, precisely because it doesn't look like danger. It looks like wisdom. It looks like self-care, in the language a modern audience might use for it. And he has to recognize it as a trap anyway, even dressed in the most sensible-sounding clothes imaginable. You know this voice too, even if you've never sat under a fig tree in your life. It's the voice that tells you the hard conversation can wait until tomorrow. The one that tells you that giving up on the thing you cared about most is actually maturity, actually growth, actually finally being realistic. Sometimes that voice is right. Tonight for this man, on this particular vow, it is not, and some part of him knows it instantly, the way you sometimes know in your own chest. A precise difference between genuine peace and simply giving up dressed up to look like peace. That distinction between genuine peace and surrender dressed up to resemble it turns out to matter more than almost anything else in how this entire night unfolds, and it's worth naming plainly before moving on. Genuine peace, by every account this story offers across the hours still to come, arrives only after something difficult has been faced directly and seen through completely. Surrender dressed up as peace arrives instead, skipping the difficult part entirely, settling for the appearance of resolution without ever actually resolving anything underneath it. The two can look remarkably similar from the outside. A calm face, a settled posture, a person who has stopped visibly struggling. Telling them apart from the inside is precisely the skill this entire night turns out to be teaching, one watch at a time. Watch what happens next, because the reasonable about to fail completely. And when it fails, Māra does not simply leave. He goes and gathers reinforcements. The forest around the fig tree, which has been quiet, almost gentle, all evening, begins, almost imperceptibly at first, to change. The texts describe it in different ways depending on the tradition. A wind that wasn't there a moment ago, a faint tremor underfoot, as though something enormous has shifted its weight somewhere just out of sight, a coldness moving through the air despite the warmth of the season. And then, without warning, the ground itself gets involved. This is the moment the story usually skips past too fast in its hurry to get to Māra's full army, the daughters, the famous confrontation everyone has heard fragments of. But slow down here for a second, because this is the hinge the whole night turns on, even this early. A man, alone in the dark, sensing correctly that something large and old and extremely interested in his failure is gathering itself just beyond the edge of what he can see. Most people at this point would run. Most people, frankly, would have run hours ago the moment the first reasonable-sounding voice suggested it might be wise to. He does not run. He does not reach for a weapon because he has none and would not use one if he did. He simply sits, facing east, breathing, watching the dark, the way you watch a storm you've already decided you're not going to try to outrun. And this is the part the statues never show you, not the serene golden figure with eyes closed in perfect peace, but the version of him sitting there in the actual dark, fully aware that something is coming, and choosing, deliberately, second by second, not to move. Hold that image, because what's coming next is not subtle, not reasonable, not gentle at all. It is, by every account that has survived, not the single most overwhelming display of fear made visible in the entire story. An army summoned for the express purpose of making one starving, exhausted, completely unarmed man finally get up and walk away. No, we're about to meet it directly. Stay with him a little longer. By now you've watched the gentlest, most reasonable temptation fail completely. The suggestion that he'd already done enough, that giving up could look like wisdom. You've felt the ground itself start to shift underfoot, the air change, something enormous gathering just past the edge of the firelight he doesn't have. Now it's time to meet what's actually coming. Māra does not throw everything at him at once. According to the oldest accounts, And this detail matters because it tells you something true about how fear actually works, not just how it worked for him. The attack comes in stages, each one calibrated to a different kind of weakness, starting with the softest one first. He sends his daughters. Later commentarial traditions give them names. Tangha, which means craving, the raw thirst for more of anything pleasant. Arati, discontent, the itch that makes even good things feel insufficient. And raga, desire in its most direct form. They appear to him, the texts say, the most beautiful forms imaginable. Not crude seduction, not anything you could easily resist by simply looking away in disgust, but genuine, aching beauty. The kind that doesn't ask you to abandon your values so much as it makes you forget for a moment that you ever had any in the first place. It's worth noticing how carefully chosen these three names actually are as a set, rather than three interchangeable flavors of temptation. Discontent and craving are not quite the same experience, even though they're often mistaken for each other. Craving reaches toward something not yet possessed. Discontent, by contrast, can settle over something already possessed, the small itch that finds even a genuinely good situation somehow insufficient, always one adjustment away from finally being enough. Desire in its most direct, physical form is a third thing again, distinct from both. Together, the three cover something close to the full range of how wanting actually shows up in an ordinary life. Not one single craving to defeat, but three related, overlapping pulls, each one capable of operating on its own even when the other two have gone quiet. Here's what most people get wrong about this part of the story. They imagine it as a test of willpower, and gritting his teeth against temptation the way you might resist a second slice of cake. That is not what's actually happening. What's happening is closer to this. Three figures appear, offering him exactly what 6 years of starvation and searching have cost him. Comfort, intimacy, the simple animal pleasure of being touched and wanted and warm. And for a moment, the question is not whether he wants it. Of course, some part of him wants it. The question is whether wanting it is the same thing as needing it, and whether needing it is the same thing as truth. He does not flinch away in horror, and he does not pretend the offer holds no appeal. According to the way later teachers have unpacked this moment, what actually happens is something quieter and in its own way more remarkable. He simply sees the offer clearly enough that wanting it stops being the same thing as moving toward it. The daughters, finding nothing to grab onto, no shame to weaponize, no hidden hunger they can inflame into action, withdraw. And it's worth understanding why later commentaries specifically chose to dramatize this part of the temptation as daughters rather than simply as abstract craving, because the choice is doing real work. A father figure sending his own children to accomplish what he himself could not is a particular kind of manipulation, one that trades on intimacy and apparent gentleness rather than threat. Tangha arati, raga do not arrive shouting or brandishing weapons. They arrive offering exactly what 6 years of discipline have cost him, wrapped in a beauty calibrated, the texts suggest, as specifically to his own deepest and most private longings. Which is precisely what makes this approach so much harder to resist cleanly than the army that follows it. An army announces itself as a threat, and threats are, in their own way, simpler to meet because the body and mind already have practiced responses to danger. An invitation dressed as tenderness gives you no obvious enemy to brace against at all. Pay attention to where his hand goes during all of this, by the way, because it doesn't go anywhere. It stays exactly where it started, resting on his knee, completely still. That stillness is doing more work in this moment than any gesture of refusal could. There's a reason stillness, rather than any more active form of resistance, turns out to be the right response here, worth pausing on briefly. Active refusal, pushing the offer away, recoiling visibly from it, would have required engaging with it on its own terms, treating it as a real threat, demanding a real defense. Stillness does something different. It simply declines to participate in the transaction at all, neither accepting the offer nor dignifying it with the kind of dramatic rejection that would have in its own way admitted how seriously it was being taken. The daughters arrive offering an exchange. Stillness is the refusal to exchange anything at all. When seduction fails, Māra escalates, and this is where the story stops being subtle at all. The Sutta Nipata lists it directly, almost like a roll call, and it is worth hearing in full, because each item on the list is something you have met in your own life, dressed in your own particular clothing. Sense desire is his first division. Discontent is his second. Hunger and thirst his third. Craving his fourth. Sloth and drowsiness his fifth. Fear his sixth. Doubt his seventh. Conceit and ingratitude his eighth. Praise wrongly gained and gained dishonestly won his ninth. And self-praise alongside contempt for others his 10th. 10 divisions. An entire army, not of monsters with claws and tusks, though the later poetic tradition, especially Ashvaghosha's Buddha Karita, will dress them exactly that way for dramatic effect, conjuring beings with the heads of boars and serpents, brandishing weapons of fire. But underneath every one of those frightening images, the same 10 human experiences every single person watching this video has felt at some point in their own life. Sloth, doubt, conceit, fear, discontent. It's worth lingering on why later poets felt the need to dress something this psychologically ordinary in such extravagant costume, and because the choice tells you something about how difficult these particular states actually are to face honestly when they're not externalized into a story. Doubt, faced directly, without a monster to hang it on, just feels like doubt. A quiet, gnawing uncertainty that erodes resolve from the inside. Far less dramatic to describe than a demon with a serpent's head, but in practice, far harder to fight, precisely because there's nothing outside yourself to point at. Ashvaghosha, writing centuries later for an audience that wanted spectacle, gave doubt a face and a weapon. But the earliest layer of the tradition, closer to whatever actually happened that night, seems far more interested in naming the experience plainly than in dramatizing it. Discontent, sloth, fear, doubt, conceit, and each one ordinary enough that you could probably name a recent example of your own for every single item on the list, if you sat with it for more than a few seconds. Something deeper is happening underneath this fear than it first appears. Because what Māra is actually attempting, across both the temptation and the terror, is not really to harm Siddhartha physically. He is trying to break the one condition the whole vow depends on: stillness. He is trying to make movement, any movement, toward pleasure or away from fear, it hardly matters which, feel more urgent than staying exactly where he is. This is not a story about a man fighting demons. This is not a story about armies and weapons in any literal sense. This is not a story about supernatural forces clashing for control of the world. This is a story about every reason a human being has ever found, at 3 in the morning, to get up and walk away from the one thing that actually mattered, concentrated into a single night, and finally for once met without flinching. The texts describe rain made of burning coals, boulders hurled through the air that on reaching him simply turn to flowers and drift down harmlessly into his lap. Wind that should tear the leaves from every tree for miles and somehow leaves the fig tree's branches entirely undisturbed. Whatever you make of those images literally, and reasonable people across 2,500 years have disagreed about exactly how literally to take them. The function they serve in the story is unmistakable. Everything Māra throws designed to harm him simply fails to land, while everything designed to convince him to leave fails to move him even an inch. He sits hour after hour now, and while the night itself seems to bend nearly to its breaking point around him, it's worth knowing that this particular disagreement, how literally to take the burning rain, the flying boulders, the army with serpent-headed soldiers, is not a modern problem invented by skeptical audiences encountering an ancient story for the first time, and Buddhist commentators have been debating it for the better part of 2,000 years, with serious thinkers landing on every point along the spectrum. Some traditional commentary treats the entire confrontation as a literal event, a genuine clash between Siddhartha and an actual cosmic being commanding actual supernatural forces. Other strands of commentary, particularly in traditions that lean more heavily on psychological interpretation, read the whole episode as an unusually vivid dramatization of an internal struggle. The boulders and burning rain standing in for the genuine intensity of fear and craving as experienced from the inside, not externalized into narrative, because narrative is how a culture without modern psychological vocabulary chose to describe and experience this overwhelming. The story itself, notably, never seems anxious to resolve this question for you. It simply tells you what happened in the most vivid language available to the people first telling it, and trusts you to draw whatever conclusion fits your own way of understanding it. And then, somewhere in the middle of all of it, Māra tries one more thing, quieter than the army, sharper than the daughters, and in its own way the cruelest weapon he has left. He leans in close, the text suggests, almost gently, almost like a friend offering hard-won advice, and says something close to this. Even if you sit here all night, even if you somehow survive what I've sent against you, no one will ever believe what happened here. There will be no witness. You will have done all of this alone, unseen, unproven, for nothing anyone will ever be able to verify. Hold that thought, because we are coming back to it directly, very soon, and it matters more than almost anything else said to him all night. This is, in its way, the most modern fear in the entire story, even though it was spoken, if it was spoken at all, 2,500 years before anyone had a phone, a camera, a single soul anywhere within 1,000 miles capable of confirming for him afterward that any of this actually happened. Think about how much of your own effort, your own private struggle, depends on someone eventually seeing it, and the work you do that no one notices. The hardest nights you've survived completely alone, with no one to tell the next morning who would actually understand what it cost you. That is precisely the fear Māra is reaching for now. Not pain, not pleasure, but the terror of mattering to no one, of having endured the worst night of your life and having it simply vanish, unwitnessed, into the dark, as though it never happened at all. It's worth noticing how precisely targeted this particular weapon is, compared to everything that came before it. The army assumed fear of harm. The daughters assumed susceptibility to pleasure, and this final approach assumes something quieter and, in many people's lives, far more persistent than either of those. The deep, often unspoken conviction that an experience only really counts, only really happened, only really mattered if someone else eventually confirms it did. That conviction runs so deep in most human lives that entire industries have been built around satisfying it. Ways of capturing, documenting, and broadcasting experience specifically so it doesn't have to rest entirely on the shaky foundation of private memory alone. Māra, in this single quiet suggestion, is reaching directly for that foundation, hours before any such industries existed to prop it up, betting that even a man this disciplined still needs, somewhere underneath all that discipline, to know that what he's doing will be seen. You have felt a version of this, pain. Maybe not under a tree, maybe not facing down an army summoned from your own oldest fears, but you know what it is to do something hard, completely alone, and wonder afterward whether it counted for anything if no one else ever knew. He does not answer Māra immediately. Sit with that small silence for a moment, because something is shifting in him even as the question lands. Something is about to unspool that has been wound tight for lifetimes, though neither he nor we are quite ready to see what it is yet. The answer, when it finally comes, is going to require him to reach towards something that isn't another person at all. But that part of the story is still a little further down the road tonight. For now, just notice, the army has failed. The daughters have failed. And the cruelest, quietest weapon, the fear that none of this will ever be witnessed, is still hanging in the air unanswered, while the moon climbs higher and the first, hardest watch of the night grinds slowly, painfully toward its end. Here's something worth sitting with for a second, away from the story entirely. And almost everyone watching this has had their own version of this exact night. Not with armies or burning rain, but with that same specific 2 a.m. dread. The kind that doesn't show up when you're busy, only when you finally stop and let the room go quiet. The bills you haven't opened, the diagnosis you haven't fully let yourself feel, the argument you keep replaying instead of sleeping. It arrives in the gap, beyond, exactly the way Māra arrived in his. Not because you did something wrong, but because stillness is the one condition under which everything you've been outrunning finally catches up. The remarkable thing about this story isn't that one man never felt that. It's that he felt every bit of it in concentrated form and discovered something on the other side of staying instead of running. That if you've ever sat with that kind of night yourself, you already understand, on some level, exactly what's at stake for him right now, hours before dawn, with the hardest part of the answer still unspoken. You've watched beauty fail to move him and an army fail to break him. And you've heard the last, quietest weapon Māra had left. The suggestion that none of this would ever be witnessed at the hardest night of his life might simply vanish unproven into the dark. That question is still hanging in the air. The moon has climbed higher, and somewhere in the silence after it was asked, something in him finally finishes shifting into place. He does not call for a teacher. He does not call for a God. He does not, in fact, call for any person at all. Because no person is there. No person could have witnessed this even if they had been, not fully, not the way it actually happened, on the inside where all of it is taking place. So he reaches for something else entirely. According to the version of this moment that has traveled the farthest and the fastest across 2,500 years of retelling, carved into stone at hundreds of sites, painted on the walls of temples from India to Japan, more widely reproduced than almost any other single gesture in the whole story. Siddhartha lowers his right hand from his lap and touches the ground. Just that, fingers against earth, and he says, in effect, "The earth is my witness." This is the gesture later traditions will call Bhūmisparśa, earth-touching, and it becomes, in the centuries that follow, the most recognizable image of this entire night, more recognizable even than his face in most renderings. One hand resting calmly in his lap, the other reaching down, fingertips brushing the ground exactly at the moment everything turns. And you can trace the spread of this single gesture across an almost unbelievable range of cultures and centuries, and it's worth doing so briefly, because it tells you something about how durable this particular image turned out to be. Stone carvings from the early centuries after his death show it at sites across the Indian subcontinent. Bronze and gilded statues carry it into Southeast Asia, where entire temple complexes in places like Bagan and Angkor would eventually be built around enormous seated figures with that same right hand reaching down. It travels into Tibetan Thangka painting, into Chinese cave temples carved directly into cliff faces, into the small portable shrines carried by traders along routes stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. No single gesture from this entire night, not the army, not the daughters, not even the dawn itself, gets reproduced more often in more places across more centuries. This one quiet motion of a henin reaching down to touch the ground. Notice what he is actually doing here, because it's easy to read past it too quickly. He is not claiming the earth as some kind of magical ally, not summoned to fight on his behalf. He is doing something much stranger and in its way much more radical. He is declaring that the proof of what happens here tonight does not depend on any other living being agreeing to remember it. The ground itself, solid, ancient, indifferent to human opinion, present before he was born and present long after he will die, has already witnessed every kindness, every sacrifice, every quiet act of goodness he has ever performed across more lifetimes than he can count. It does not need to be convinced. It was already there. This is the hinge the whole night turns on, and it's worth being honest about why. Māra's question, who will ever know this happened, is underneath the supernatural staging. One of the most ordinary and devastating questions a person can ask themselves in the dark. And the answer Siddhartha gives is not someone will know, not people will eventually believe me. The answer is closer to this. It does not need to be witnessed by anyone for it to be true. The ground does not grade your effort by how visible it was. Neither in the end does anything that actually matters. You have probably done something hard and unwitnessed in your own life. Sat up all night with someone you loved and never told anyone how frightened you were. Made a decision that cost you something and let it simply be true without needing anyone else to confirm it. If so, you already understand more than you might think exactly what's happening in this gesture. Here's where that earlier image comes back, the one we asked you to hold on to 2 chapters ago. Remember the golden bowl, the one Sujata asked him to set on the river that morning, the one that floated upstream against everything water is supposed to do? At the time, it looked like a small, strange piece of folk magic, easy to skip past on the way to the more dramatic parts of the story. But look at it again now. Beside this moment, a bowl set against the current of a river, and a hand set against the current of an argument that is just tried, with everything in its power, to convince him that nothing unwitnessed can be real. Both of them are doing the same thing in different registers. Both are refusals to accept the ordinary rules. Water flows downstream. Unwitnessed effort doesn't count as the final word on what's possible. The river bent for him that morning. Now in the deepest part of the night, the earth itself is being asked to bend the same way, to stand as proof where no human witness exists. It's worth noticing, too, the quiet symmetry in who actually offered each of these 2 gestures. The bowl was Sujata's idea, a small piece of village folk wisdom handed to him by someone with no stake in his search at all, offered the way you might pass along a lucky custom without fully expecting it to matter. The earth touching is entirely his own, arrived at alone in the dark with no one to suggest it to him. One gesture was given, the other had to be found, and yet both, by the time this night is finished, turn out to be answering exactly the same fear, that nothing real can happen or be proven to have happened without somebody else standing nearby to see it. This is not something you need to force into shape as a metaphor. The text presents it almost matter-of-factly. He touches the ground, and the ground responds, described variously as trembling, roaring, or simply settling into a stillness so complete that even Māra's remaining forces feel it and falter. Whatever literally happened in that exact moment 2,500 years ago, the symbolic shape of it has outlived every empire that has risen and fallen since. The earth itself testified on behalf of a man no other living witness was present to vouch for. Here is what most retellings get wrong about what happens immediately after. Eager as they are to move straight to images of triumph, Māra does not vanish in a flash of defeated light. He withdraws, slowly, the way fear actually leaves a body, not all at once, but in stages, with a kind of stubborn, lingering presence that takes its time admitting defeat. The daughters retreat first, then the army, division by division. The way smoke clears from a room after the fire that made it has already gone out. There is a detail in some versions of this withdrawal worth including because it adds a strange, almost wry note to what could otherwise read as pure triumph. Māra, in several tellings, does not leave silently. He is described muttering, complaining, almost sulking, the way anyone might after putting enormous effort into a plan that simply failed to land. Less a defeated cosmic villain slinking off in disgrace, more like someone who has just lost an argument they were absolutely certain they would win, grumbling about it on the way out the door. Later commentators have found this detail almost comforting rather than alarming, not precisely because of how human it makes the whole confrontation feel. Even Māra, the personification of every fear that ever talked someone out of finishing what they started, does not vanish as some grand, dignified force defeated by an equally grand opponent. He simply runs out of moves, the way fear itself eventually runs out of moves against someone who has genuinely stopped feeding it. By the time the last of it has gone, something has changed in the texture of the night itself. The forest, which has spent hours roaring, trembling, and pressing in on him, goes quiet. Not the brittle, charged quiet of something about to happen, but a different kind of stillness altogether, the kind that arrives only after a long struggle has genuinely, finally ended. Watch what he chooses not to fight in this final withdrawal, because it tells you something important about what real victory looked like for Tim. He does not chase Māra down, he does not gloat. He does not even, by most accounts, not feel triumphant in the way you might expect after surviving an assault like that. What he feels instead, in the relative quiet that follows, is something closer to clarity, a wide-open, undefended kind of attention, the way a room feels different after a long storm has finally passed and the windows can be opened again. This absence of triumph is worth dwelling on a little longer, because triumph would actually be the wrong response, given what the whole confrontation was ever really about. A triumphant reaction implies an opponent genuinely defeated, vanquished, removed from the field for good. And Māra, as you already know from how often he reappears in smaller form throughout the rest of the texts, is never permanently removed from anyone's life, including the Buddha's own life in the years that follow. And what changed tonight was not that fear, doubt, and craving were destroyed as forces in the world. What changed was that one particular mind, in this particular hour, finally stopped needing to fight them at all, because it had stopped offering them anything to grab onto. Triumph belongs to battles that end with one side gone. What happened here belongs to something quieter and, in its way, more durable. A battlefield that simply stopped being a battlefield because one side had nothing left to defend. This is where the first watch of the night, the hardest and most violent watch, finally ends. There will be no more armies tonight. There will be no more daughters sent to tempt him. No more rain of fire. No more roaring forest pressing in from every side. What remains is something quieter and in its own way far more demanding. The work of actually looking, clearly, at everything the silence has been holding back this entire time. If this story is landing for you, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because what's coming over the next several hours of this night is unlike anything most people have ever heard told in this kind of detail, and you won't want to miss where it goes. The moon has passed its highest point. The first watch is over, and the man sitting beneath the fig tree, hand still resting lightly against the earth that just stood witness for him, is about to discover that the hardest fighting of the night is already finished, and the deepest seeing has not yet begun. By now you've watched the army fail, the daughters fail, and the cruelest question of all, who will ever know this happened, answered not with a person but with the ground itself. The first watch of the night is over. Māra is gone, at least for now. And the man under the fig tree is left for the first time in hours, with nothing left to resist. This is, in its own way, a more dangerous moment than anything that came before it, because relief can be its own kind of trap. After a fight that long, the easiest thing in the world would be to simply rest in the quiet, to mistake the absence of attack for the presence of understanding, and call it a night well spent. He does not do that. And to understand what he does instead, you need to go back briefly. Further back than the palace, further back than the river, to two men who, 6 years earlier, very nearly convinced him he had already found what he was looking for. The first was named Alara Kalama, a respected teacher, widely admired, who led Siddhartha through a series of deepening meditative states until he reached what Kalama himself called the highest possible attainment, a state of such profound stillness that the ordinary business of having a self with wants and fears seemed to dissolve into something close to nothingness. Kalama was delighted. He told Siddhartha he had reached the summit, the same summit Kalama himself had reached, and invited him to stay and teach alongside him as an equal. Siddhartha sat with that state, and he asked himself a question that on the surface sounds almost ungrateful, given how rare and how hard won that level of attainment actually was. Does this end suffering, or does it simply rest on top of it for a while? The honest answer, the more he looked at it, was the second one. The stillness was real, the relief was real. But the moment he came out of that deep absorption, the same old hungers, the same old fears were waiting for him exactly where he'd left them, completely undiminished. He had found an extraordinarily comfortable room inside the same burning house. He had not put out the fire. It's worth sitting with that image a moment longer, because it captures something a less careful telling of this part of the story might rush past. A comfortable room inside a burning house is not nothing. It is, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary achievement, one most people who ever set foot in that house never managed to find at all. The mistake would be in mistaking comfort for the absence of fire. Kalama had built something genuinely impressive. He had simply, understandably, stopped looking past the comfort of the room itself to ask whether the building around it was actually still burning. So he left, politely. By every account, there's no suggestion of contempt for Kalama, only a quiet refusal to call something finished that wasn't. It's worth noting, too, what this departure actually cost him socially, because it's easy to underestimate from a distance of 2,500 years. Kalama was not a minor figure. He led an established, respected community with real status attached to it, and he had just offered an unusually talented young student co-leadership of that entire community, a position most ambitious seekers of that era would have leapt at without a second thought, status, security, and an instant audience all at once. Walking away from that offer on the strength of nothing more than a private, unprovable conviction that something essential was still missing, took a particular kind of stubbornness that the texts don't dwell on, but that's worth pausing to admire. The willingness to remain genuinely uncertain, in public rather than accept a comfortable and prestigious answer that some part of him already suspected was incomplete. The second teacher, Uddaka Ramaputta, taught him to go even further, into a state so refined that almost nothing remained of ordinary perception at all. Not quite perception, not quite the absence of it, a state poised on the very edge of consciousness itself. Uddaka's own teacher and father had reached this place and called it the end of the path. Uddaka offered Siddhartha leadership of the entire community on the strength of how quickly he'd mastered it. And Siddhartha asked the same question again and got underneath the magnificent stillness the same honest answer. Still not it, still resting on top of the fire instead of putting it out. And here's what most people get wrong about this part of his life. They assume the 6 years of searching were 6 years of failure, false start after false start, until finally, under the fig tree, something different happened. That's not quite right. Those years with Kalama and Uddaka weren't failures at all. They were training. They gave him a depth of concentration, a familiarity with the inner terrain of his own mind that almost no one else alive at that time possessed. What he lacked wasn't skill. What he lacked was the willingness to stop where everyone else had stopped, and to keep asking the one question that kept ruining otherwise perfectly good answers. But does this end the suffering or just rest on top of it? Now, back to the tree, back to the quiet that has settled in after Māra's withdrawal. He draws on every bit of that hard-won skill now, but pointed somewhere neither Kalama nor Uddaka ever aimed it. Not toward a deeper rest, but toward a clearer seeing. The text described this using a word you'll want to hold on to because it comes up constantly in everything that follows tonight. Samadhi, a Pali word that gets translated a dozen different ways. Collectedness, unification, a settled gathering of the whole mind into one undivided point, but which is best understood maybe as the opposite of distraction. Not blankness, not absence, Mind so unified it can finally hold something difficult without flinching away from it. And it's worth understanding why this particular capacity, a mind that can hold difficulty without flinching, turns out to matter so much more than raw intelligence or sincere effort on their own. Plenty of seekers in this same era, by every account, were every bit as sincere as Siddhartha, every bit as committed to ending suffering, and never got past this exact threshold. The difference, again and again across the texts, comes down to this same word: a mind capable of remaining gathered, undistracted, and unshaken in the presence of whatever arose, rather than scattering, flinching, or grasping the instant something difficult or beautiful appeared. And years with Kalama and Uddaka had built exactly this capacity, even though neither teacher had known what to do with it once it was built. Siddhartha's contribution on this particular night was not a deeper concentration than either of them had achieved. It was the decision to point that same hard-won concentration somewhere neither of them had ever thought to aim it. Within that samadhi, the texts describe him moving through 4 progressively deeper states called jhana, absorptions, each one quieter and more refined than the last. The first jhana arises with a kind of joyful, almost effortful concentration, the mind still aware of its own happiness at having found this stillness. The second drops even that subtle effort, leaving pure joy and ease without the sense of working to maintain it. The third lets go of the joy itself, and leaving a profound equanimous contentment underneath. And the fourth, this is the one worth sitting with longest, arrives at a state the texts describe as beyond both pleasure and pain, a luminous, even unshaken clarity, neither grasping at anything pleasant nor recoiling from anything difficult. It helps to walk through what each of those 4 states would actually have felt like from the inside, rather than treating them as a dry list. The first jhana, by the traditional descriptions, still carries something of effort in it, a mind that has successfully gathered itself after the chaos of ordinary thinking, and feels a real, almost giddy relief at having done so, the way you might feel real satisfaction the first time a difficult posture in an unfamiliar practice finally clicks into place. The second jhana lets that effort go, a way a swimmer stops fighting the water once they've found the right rhythm, leaving only the pleasure of the gathered mind without the work of gathering it. The third drops even the pleasure in favor of something quieter and, in its own way, sturdier: equanimity, an evenness that doesn't depend on anything continuing to feel good in order to remain steady. And the fourth, hardest to describe in ordinary language, because ordinary language is built almost entirely around naming things as pleasant or unpleasant, settles into a kind of clear, bright neutrality that the texts keep reaching for new words to approximate: purity, luminosity, an attention so balanced it no longer tips toward wanting more of this or less of that. This is the part most people skip past too quickly, eager to get to the dramatic 3 knowledges that are coming. But notice what's actually being built here, methodically, deliberately, over what is probably another hour or more of the night. A mind so stable, so undistracted, so free of both craving and aversion, that for the first time in human history, if the texts are to be believed, it becomes possible to look directly at the deepest patterns running underneath an entire life, underneath countless lives, without the looking itself disturbing what's being seen. There's a reason this methodical, almost technical build-up matters so much to the story, even though it makes for far less dramatic viewing than an army or a vision. Plenty of traditions before and after this one have produced people willing to look hard at difficult truths about existence. What seems to distinguish what's happening under this particular tree, on this particular night, is the specific combination of willingness and capacity arriving together, fully matched for what the texts suggest may have been the first time. Willingness without capacity tends to produce either denial, looking away before the difficult difficulty becomes unbearable, or collapse, a mind shattering under weight it was never built to hold. Capacity without willingness, meanwhile, simply never gets pointed at the hardest questions in the first place, settling instead for smaller, more comfortable uses of an impressive but underemployed skill. 6 years of training had given Siddhartha the capacity. This particular night, fueled by a vow he had already proven hours earlier he was not going to break, finally supplied the willingness to use it on the one question that actually mattered. Think of it this way, if it helps. Imagine trying to read fine print at the bottom of a page while someone keeps shaking the page. That's what every previous attempt at insight, his and everyone else's before him, had been like. Genuine effort, genuine intelligence, undermined by a mind too restless, too reactive, too busy flinching at its own discoveries to actually hold them steady long enough to understand them. What the fourth jhana gives him is a perfectly still page, nothing left to shake it, and it's worth being plain about what's actually true of this stillness, regardless of tradition. It is not the destination, it is the instrument. He has spent his whole life, and a good portion of this very night, building the one tool sharp enough and steady enough to actually do what comes next. And because what comes next is the part of the story almost no one tells in any real detail. The part where, somewhere in the deep hours of the night, with the moon now well past its peak and the first hint of the deepest, darkest part of the night settling in, he turns that perfectly still attention toward a question even larger than the one Māra raised. Not just will anyone witness this, something closer to what is actually true. And underneath everything I have ever believed about myself, hold that question, because in the hour that follows, the answer is going to arrive in a form nobody, not Kalama, not Uddaka, not any teacher before him in the long, mostly unrecorded history of human beings trying to understand their own minds, had ever fully reached. There's a detail here easy to miss, by the way. That connects back to something Māra said hours ago and never got a real answer beyond the earth-touching. The claim that no one would ever believe this happened, that it would go forever unwitnessed. What's about to unfold over the rest of this night is, in a strange way, the deeper answer to that fear. Not because anyone else is watching, but because what he is about to see is going to become so clear, so completely without doubt, that for the rest of his life, whenever anyone asks him how he knows what he knows, his answer will not be faith, it will be memory. He was there, he saw it happen, the way you remember a thing that happened to you yesterday, not the way you believe a thing someone once told you. Stay with him a little longer. The hardest fighting of the night is over, and what's coming now is something else entirely. Quieter, stranger, and in its own way, far more astonishing than any army Māra could have sent. By now you've watched him build, hour by hour, the single steadiest instrument any human mind had ever produced. 4 jhanas deep, every distraction gone quiet, every flinch removed. 2 old teachers, both convinced they'd reached the summit, are part of his past now, useful but incomplete. The hardest fighting of the night is behind him. What's coming next is the part almost nobody tells in any real detail, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like a man sitting perfectly still with his eyes most likely closed, doing nothing visible at all. But on the inside, something enormous is about to begin. And the texts call what happens next the first of 3 knowledges, 3 distinct kinds of seeing that arrive, one after another, over the remaining watches of the night, each one building directly on the steadiness of the one before it. And the first knowledge is, in its own way, the strangest place to begin, because it doesn't start with the present moment or even with this particular life. It starts by reaching backward, turning that perfectly stable attention toward his own past. Siddhartha begins to remember, not the ordinary kind of remembering, the way you might recall what you had for breakfast or the shape of a childhood bedroom. This is something else. The Mahāsākaka Sutta describes it as recollecting one life, then 2, then 5, then 50, then 100, then 1,000, then tens of thousands of lives, each one arising in detail, a name he once carried, a family he once belonged to, the particular flavor of joy or grief that filled a particular existence, the way each one ended, and the way the next one began. This is the part the statues never show you, mostly because there's no single gesture that could possibly capture it. A man sitting under a tree, apparently motionless, while inside him an almost unthinkable volume of lived experience scrolls past, not as abstract facts, the way you might read a list of dates in a history book, but as memory full and textured, and his, the way you remember the smell of a room you haven't stood in for 20 years the instant you walk back into it. Try for a moment to actually picture what that would feel like. Not the content of any single memory, but the sheer accumulating weight of it. Life after life after life, each one carrying its own particular griefs, its own particular loves, its own particular unfinished business, and stacking up behind him further than thought can comfortably reach. Most people spend an entire lifetime struggling to make peace with the handful of decades they can actually remember. He is, in the space of one night, not being shown all of it, going back further than the human mind has any obvious right to go. There's a reason this particular knowledge had to come first, before either of the two that follow it, and it's worth understanding why. And everything that happens later in the night, the seeing of how every being's actions ripple forward, the tracing of the chain that has no first link, depends on a mind that has already stopped flinching at the sheer scale of what it's looking at. A mind that still clung tightly to the idea of being one fixed person, living one bounded life, would have had nowhere to put an experience this large. It would have broken under the weight of it, or simply refused to look at all of it clearly, the way an eye looks away from a light too bright to take in directly. The 4 jhanas built earlier in the night weren't simply a nice-to-have preparation. They were the only reason a mind could survive contact with something this vast without shattering, or worse, without simply deciding none of it was real, in order to protect itself from feeling the size of it. And here's the detail that should stop you, the detail that doesn't fit neatly into the rest of the account, the kind of thing that, if this were fiction, a careful editor would have cut for not paying off cleanly. Somewhere in that vast unspooling river of past lives, one single face surfaces, clear, specific, unexplained, and then is gone again, swept onward by the next life and the next, before he has any chance to understand why it mattered. The texts themselves don't dwell on it. They move on to describe the broader sweep of the knowledge, the staggering scale of it, the way entire ages rise and fall behind him like weather. But hold on to that face anyway. Keep this in mind, it matters later tonight, in a way that has nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with how suffering actually moves from one life to the next, one person to the next, largely without anyone choosing it on purpose. Notice what this knowledge is not doing, by the way, because it's tempting to imagine it as some kind of cosmic vindication, proof, finally, of who he really is, evidence of some grand destiny stretching back through the ages. That is not the tone of the account at all. If anything, the effect described is closer to the opposite, a kind of vast, sobering humility. Lifetime after lifetime, he sees himself born into wealth and poverty both, beauty and plainness both, kindness and cruelty both, joy and devastation both, the same basic pattern, over and over, with the details endlessly rearranged but the underlying shape unchanged. Born, grasped at something, lost it, or got it, and found it wasn't enough, died, began again. This is not a story about discovering he was always secretly special. This is not a story about uncovering a hidden destiny that explains away the difficulty of this very night. This is not a story about being shown a comforting cosmic plan with himself at the center of it. This is a story about seeing with total clarity for the first time exactly how relentless and exactly how repetitive the whole pattern of craving and rebirth actually is, which is a far harder thing to sit with than any comforting myth would have been. There's a particular kind of disappointment worth naming here. one that almost never gets discussed in popular tellings of this story, and because it cuts against the triumphant tone people generally want from a tale about enlightenment. A mind hoping for vindication, hoping to discover that its long search had been leading towards some special destiny all along, would have found something close to the opposite in this first knowledge. Not a single triumphant ascent through ever more glorious lives, each one better than the last, building toward this moment as an inevitable culmination, but a much messier, much more ordinary record, lifetime after lifetime, of the same basic mistakes made over and over in slightly different clothing. Reaching for comfort, mistaking temporary relief for lasting peace, losing what was loved and grieving and reaching again. There is no part of this record that flatters the one seeing it, and that, oddly, may be exactly what makes it trustworthy rather than self-serving. A vision shaped to console him would have looked very different from a vision shaped to show him, plainly, the actual repeating architecture of suffering he had spent 6 years trying to understand. You don't need countless past lives of your own to recognize the shape of what he's seeing, by the way. Think about your own life, not just this one, just the part you can actually remember. How many times have you chased the exact same kind of relief in slightly different packaging and been surprised every single time that it didn't quite satisfy the way you expected? A different job, a different relationship, a different city, a different version of yourself you were sure would finally feel like enough. And the pattern doesn't always announce itself as a pattern while you're living inside it. It usually takes distance, sometimes years of it, before you can see the repetition clearly enough to name it. He is being given that distance now, applied not to one lifetime, but to what the texts insist were uncountable numbers of them, all the way back. There's a useful comparison here to something far more ordinary than countless past lives, worth sitting with for a moment. Anyone who has ever gone back through old photographs or old journals or old messages from a much earlier version of themselves knows a small, compressed version of exactly this experience. The slightly uncomfortable recognition of how often you made the same kind of decision, chased the same kind of relief, repeated the same kind of mistake across years you remembered at the time as feeling entirely distinct from each other. 10 years of a life can feel, while you're living through it, like 10 completely different chapters, each one shaped by its own unique circumstances. Looked back on from enough distance, the same handful of patterns tend to surface again and again, wearing different clothes. What Siddhartha is being shown tonight is that same basic experience, scaled up almost beyond imagining. Not 10 years looked back on from a decade's distance, but uncountable lifetimes looked back on from a vantage point built specifically across 6 years of training and one entire night of effort to finally be steady enough to hold the full weight of what it was seeing. Here's the part nobody tells you about what this actually feels like. As best as the old accounts can convey it, it is not described as triumphant. It is not described as a moment of celebration. The dominant note, and if you read the Mahasakaka Sutta closely, is almost clinical in its plainness. A steady, unflinching observation, life after life, the way a doctor reviews a long and complicated chart without flinching at any single entry, looking for the pattern underneath all the individual symptoms. And by the time the first knowledge has run its full course, by the time the unimaginable scroll of past existence has for the moment finished unspooling, something in him has shifted again, the way the texture of the air shifts in the hour just before a storm finally breaks open into rain. He has seen now with absolute clarity where he has been. Night is not finished with him yet, though, because seeing where you've been is only the first of 3 knowledges still to come, and the next one is going to ask something even harder of him, not just to look backward at his own long procession of lives, but to look outward at everyone else's. What he's about to see next doesn't just concern his own past. Sit with that for a moment before we go on, because it concerns the whole vast churning machine of cause and consequence that every living being, in every direction, is caught inside of, whether they know it or not. If a question like this is the kind of thing that actually sticks with you long after the video ends, what would it be like to see your own life's pattern laid out clearly enough to finally recognize it? That's worth sitting with and worth telling me about below. What's the pattern you keep noticing yourself repeat in slightly different clothing again and again? The moon has moved further still, somewhere below the eastern horizon, though neither he nor anyone else watching can see it yet. The first faint suggestion of dawn is still hours away. But the night has entered its second great watch, and what comes next is going to widen everything the first watch only began to open. By now you've watched an entire ocean of past lives rise and recede behind him, one unexplained face surfacing briefly out of the flood before vanishing again into the count. The first knowledge has run its course. The night has entered its deepest stretch, the hours when even a quiet village goes completely still, when the only sounds left are the ones the forest makes on its own, without any human help at all. And now the texts say, that same perfectly steadied attention turns outward. This is the second of the three knowledges, and the Mahāsākaka Sutta describes it using an image worth holding on to carefully. A divine eye, Dibbakaku, clear and unclouded, capable of seeing beings as they pass away from one existence and arise in another, across every realm, every condition, every circumstance, and crucially seeing exactly why each one ends up where it does. Here's where the texts get specific in a way that should make you sit up a little. It's not described as a vague cosmic vision, all light and no detail. It's described almost procedurally. This being did this kind of action, with this kind of intention behind it, and as a direct consequence arose in that particular condition. That being did the opposite and arose somewhere else entirely. Kindness traced forward into its fruit. Cruelty not traced forward into its fruit, not as punishment handed down by some judge sitting in the sky, but as a kind of relentless natural law, as mechanical and as impartial as anything in the physical world. A seed of a certain kind reliably producing a tree of a certain kind, no exceptions, no special pleading, no escape clause for anyone, including none. The texts make clear, including him. The word for this is karma, and it's worth pausing on because almost no word from this entire story has been more thoroughly misunderstood by the time it reached the modern world. Karma does not mean fate. It does not mean some cosmic scoreboard keeping tally of good deeds and bad ones, doling out rewards and punishments from a distance. In its oldest and most precise sense, karma simply means action, specifically intentional action. And the seeing he is doing right now is the seeing of exactly how those actions ripple forward, life after life, shaping the conditions each subsequent existence arises into. It's worth being specific about what this knowledge does and does not claim, because so much confusion has accumulated around this word over the centuries since. It does not claim that every misfortune a person suffers is a punishment they personally earned in some previous life, a reading that later popular traditions sometimes leaned into in ways the earliest texts resist. What's being described here is closer to a description of process than a moral verdict. Actions rooted in greed, hatred, or confusion tend, as a matter of observable pattern rather than divine sentencing, to produce conditions that compound suffering. Actions rooted in generosity, kindness, or clear seeing tend to produce conditions that ease it. The texts describe him watching this pattern play out across realm after realm, and life after life, the way you might watch weather patterns play out across a landscape over years of observation, not as something imposed from outside by a judge, but as something the universe simply does, the way water simply flows downhill with no exception made for anyone, regardless of how powerful, beloved, or well-intentioned they happen to be in any given life. Notice what this knowledge is actually doing to the first one. The first knowledge showed him his own long procession of lives. This one shows him that his procession was never separate from anyone else's. Every life he lived touched other lives. No. Every choice rippled outward into conditions that other beings entirely unknown to him would eventually inherit. The boundary between my suffering and everyone else's suffering, which felt so solid for most of his life, is dissolving fast under this kind of seeing, not as a poetic idea, but as something closer to a physical fact observed directly, the way you'd observe water finding its level. Think about how strange this actually is, set against the basic assumption almost everyone carries through ordinary life without ever questioning it, that your suffering is fundamentally yours, contained within the boundary of your own skin, separate in some important sense from the suffering of the stranger sitting 2 seats away from you on a train, or the suffering of someone living an ocean away whose name you will never learn. That assumption is so deeply built into ordinary perception that it rarely even announces itself as an assumption. It simply feels like the shape of reality. What the second knowledge is showing him, hour by hour in this deep stretch of the night, is that the boundary was never as solid as it felt, that the same causes producing his own suffering are, at every moment, producing identical suffering in beings he will never meet, none, through the exact same mechanism, with no exception carved out anywhere for anyone. This is where the emotional weight of the night shifts again. And it's worth being honest about what that weight actually feels like, because it is not relief. If anything, the second knowledge is heavier than the first. Seeing your own pattern of suffering is one kind of difficulty. Seeing with total clarity that the same blind, grasping, repeating pattern is playing out simultaneously across countless other beings, all of them just as caught, just as unaware, just as convinced that their particular version of craving will finally be the one that satisfies. That is a different order of weight entirely. There's a reason later tradition will eventually come to treat this exact knowledge as the seed of something the texts call compassion on an entirely different scale than ordinary kindness. Not pity, looking down from a position of safety at someone else's trouble, but something closer to a direct, felt recognition that there is ultimately no meaningful distance between his own struggle and everyone else's. Ordinary compassion tends to require effort, a deliberate choice to extend concern toward people outside your immediate circle. And what's beginning to take root in him during this stretch of the night looks less like an effort and more like a simple consequence of seeing clearly. Once the boundary between my suffering and their suffering has genuinely dissolved, withholding concern for one while extending it to the other stops being a real option at all. The way you can't selectively feel pain in only one half of a body you've come to recognize as entirely your own. You know this feeling too, in a smaller way. If you've ever watched someone you love repeat a mistake you've already made yourself years earlier and understood with total certainty exactly where it was going to lead, long before they could see it themselves. Multiply that by every being in every realm, visible now with total clarity, and you start to get some sense of the scale of what's pressing down on him in these hours, somewhere in the deep middle of the night, with dawn still not yet visible on the horizon. Something underneath the fear is about to surface in a different register now. Not the fear of an army, not the fear of going unwitnessed, but something closer to grief on a scale almost too large to hold. The sheer, unrelenting momentum of suffering, repeating itself, life after life, being after being, with no one anywhere fully understanding why or how to stop it. And here's the part the texts agree on, almost word for word, regardless of tradition. This knowledge, as devastating as it could have been on its own, does not break him. It does not collapse into despair. None. The steadiness built across 4 Hanas, the same stillness that let him watch Māra's entire army without flinching, holds underneath this weight too, not by hardening against it, but by simply continuing to look clearly without turning away, the way you might keep your eyes open during something painful, precisely because looking away has never once actually solved anything. And there is something quietly remarkable buried in that fact, worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. A mind that strong, watching something that heavy and not breaking. Not because the weight was small, because the mind had finally become large enough to hold it. On this particular relationship, between the size of a difficulty and the size of the container available to hold it, turns out to matter more than almost anything else in how a person actually copes with hard truths, a story and an ordinary life both. The same piece of difficult news, the same loss, the same hard realization about how the world actually works, can break one person and leave another relatively steady, and the difference rarely has much to do with the difficulty itself being objectively larger or smaller. It has to do with how much capacity the receiving mind happened to have available at the moment the difficulty arrived. And 6 years of training and one entire night of patient, hour-by-hour effort had been building exactly this kind of capacity in Siddhartha, expanding what his mind was able to hold without flinching, long before this particular knowledge ever arrived to test it. The second knowledge does not land on him by accident at a moment when he happens to be ready for it. The entire architecture of the night, watch by watch, was building the capacity specifically so that when this weight did arrive, there would be room enough inside him to actually hold it. This is, in its own strange way, one of the moments in this story that lands closest to something modern science has only recently started to describe with any precision. Researchers studying long-term meditators, monks with tens of thousands of hours of practice, brains scanned during deep states of absorption, have repeatedly found something striking, measurable quieting in what's called the default mode network, the cluster of brain regions most associated with the ordinary restless sense of being a separate self, narrating your own story, defending your own boundaries. No, constantly distinguishing me from everything else. In the deepest states researchers have measured, that network goes unusually quiet, and practitioners report, not with remarkable consistency across very different cultures and very different language, a loosening of exactly the boundary this knowledge is dissolving right now, the felt line between one being's suffering and another's. None. Some of the most widely cited work in this area comes out of long-running collaborations between contemplative practitioners and neuroscientists over the past several decades. Studies in which experienced meditators were invited into brain imaging labs and asked to enter the same kinds of deep absorptive states their traditions had been describing in non-scientific language for centuries. What those scans tend to show is not simply the brain going quiet in some vague, generic sense, but something more specific. A measurable drop in activity in exactly the regions responsible for self-referential thought, the inner narrator that spends most ordinary waking hours quietly commenting on every experience in terms of how it affects me. Practitioners coming out of these states frequently describe, independently of each other, and often in remarkably similar language, a felt loosening of the boundary between their own experience and the experience of others, not as a poetic flourish, but as something closer to a direct perceptual shift, the same kind of shift the second knowledge describes happening to Siddhartha in these very hours. None of that, obviously, proves what happened under the fig tree 2,500 years ago. But it does suggest something worth sitting with, that the kind of seeing described in this ancient account, the dissolving of the wall between self and other, achieved through sustained and disciplined stillness rather than belief, isn't simply a poetic flourish invented by later storytellers. It maps with an unsettling degree of precision onto something modern instruments can actually detect happening in a living human brain. But that's a bridge to come back to. Right now, under the tree, the second knowledge is still unfolding. There is no comfortable place yet to set it down. He has seen where he has come from. He has seen how every being's suffering ripples forward into every other being's. And there won't be another fear like the first watch's army tonight. That kind of test is already behind him. But there is still a third knowledge waiting in the deepest, darkest hour before dawn, and it is going to ask him to do something neither of the first two demanded. Not just to see the pattern, but to finally understand what's actually driving it. Now you've watched two knowledges arrive and neither one break him. First the long backward river of his own countless lives, then the wider, heavier seeing of how every being's actions ripple forward into every other being's fate. He has seen where suffering has been. He has seen how far it travels. What he has not yet seen in all of this is the one thing that would actually let him do anything about it. Why it happens at all. That is what the third knowledge is for. The night has reached its deepest hour now. The hour with no name in most languages. The hour past midnight and past the deep middle stretch. The hour when even insomniacs usually give up and finally drift off. When the temperature drops its last few degrees before the long, slow climb back toward dawn. The forest around him has been silent for so long it has started to feel less like silence and more like a held breath. Here's where most people get this part of the story wrong, and it's an honest mistake to make because it's the hardest part to dramatize. There is no vision here, no sweeping river of lives, no divine eye scanning across realms. What arrives instead is something that sounds on the surface and almost dry, a chain of reasoning traced link by link, each one causing the next, each one capable of being traced backward to find what caused it. The texts call it paticca dependent origination, or, in a phrase some translators prefer because it's a little easier to actually feel, this arises because that arose. And the chain, as Siddhartha traces it this night, runs something like this, though we'll walk it slowly rather than reciting it as a list, because reciting it as a list is exactly how most people lose the thread. He starts where the suffering is most obvious, with old age, sickness, death, plain unavoidable facts that first cracked something open in him decades ago outside the palace walls, the three sites that started this entire search. Death is real, fine, but death on its own doesn't explain why death feels like such an unbearable wound rather than simply a fact. The way the changing of seasons is a fact. So he looks one link further back and finds birth. You cannot lose a life you were never given, and birth is the condition that makes loss possible at all. It's worth knowing as this chain unfolds that later tradition would eventually formalize it into a fixed list of 12 links, taught and memorized across centuries of subsequent practice, each one given a precise technical term in Pali. What you're watching unfold tonight in real time is effectively the discovery of that list, traced for the first time by a single mind working backward through its own direct experience rather than received as already finished doctrine from someone else. That distinction matters more than it might seem, and every later student who memorized this same chain across the centuries that followed would be receiving something Siddhartha himself had to work out from nothing in the dark, with no list to check his findings against, no teacher to confirm whether he'd missed a link or added one that didn't belong. The version arriving in this chapter is the working out, not the finished doctrine, which is part of why it unfolds the way it does, link discovered after link, each one only becoming visible once the one after it had already been traced back as far as it would go. But why does birth keep happening over and over, the way the first knowledge has just shown him it does? He looks back again and finds, becoming the restless momentum of a being constantly forming itself into something, reaching toward its next condition the way a flame reaches toward whatever fuel is nearest. And what drives that becoming? Clinging, grasping at experiences, at identities, at the comforting story of being a fixed, tenuous self that needs to be protected and fed. And clinging, trade link further, rests on craving. Tangha, the same word, the same force that showed up hours ago wearing the face of Māra's daughters. The same thirst, not a separate enemy at all, it turns out, but the same one, now seen at the root rather than at the surface, where it had simply been disguised as desire for comfort, for beauty, for being wanted. It helps to walk this chain against something more immediate than cosmic scale rebirth, because the same structure, the texts and later teachers insist that plays out inside a single ordinary day just as reliably as it plays out across lifetimes. A pleasant taste touches the tongue, contact, meeting feeling. The feeling is pleasant, so a small thirst arises for more of it, craving, and the thirst hardens into a decision to reach for a second helping, a third, clinging. That clinging shapes the next moment of experience, the next choice, the next small identity. I am someone who needs this. Becoming none. And from that becoming, a new moment is born, carrying its own momentum forward into the moment after it. Birth, in the small sense, happening dozens of times a day, long before anyone needs to invoke an entire future existence to see the pattern clearly. The chain Siddhartha is tracing this night at the scale of countless lifetimes is the very same chain that governs something as small as reaching for a second helping of food you didn't actually need. That's part of what makes this third knowledge so quietly devastating. It isn't describing some exotic cosmic mechanism reserved for grand questions of life and death. It's describing the precise mechanics of an ordinary afternoon, magnified until the pattern becomes impossible to miss. And craving itself, traced back one link further still, rests on feeling, the simple, immediate sense of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that arises the instant any experience touches you at all, before thought even has time to comment on it. And feeling depends on contact, the meeting of an experience with a sense, an eye meeting a sight, an ear meeting a sound, and contact depends on the 6 sense bases existing at all: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, and those depend on having a body and mind in the first place, which depends on consciousness arising at all, and which depends, the chain insists, going back further than seems possible, on formations, the accumulated momentum of past intentional action. The same karma, the second knowledge, just showed him rippling forward life after life, and formations themselves, traced to their root, depend on one final thing: ignorance, not knowing, a fundamental ancient not seeing that the chain even exists at all. No, here's the part nobody tells you about what this actually feels like to discover, sitting there in the dark, link by link. It is not a comforting realization. There's a reason this chapter is heavier than the ones around it. And because what the chain reveals with total and inescapable clarity is that there is no single villain anywhere in it. No first cause sitting outside the loop deciding to set the whole miserable machine into motion. Just ignorance feeding formations, feeding consciousness, feeding name and form, feeding contact, feeding feeling, feeding craving, feeding clinging, feeding becoming, feeding birth, feeding aging and death and all the grief that comes with them. And then, with the next breath, the whole cycle beginning again, unbroken, unowned by anyone, simply turning. The way a wheel turns, because nothing has yet stopped it from turning. This is the chain with no first link. Sit with that phrase for a second because it matters more than it sounds like it should. We have been telling this story this whole time as if there were a clean beginning somewhere. A palace, a departure, a 6-year search, a single night under a tree. What the third knowledge reveals is that the actual chain underneath all suffering has no beginning anyone can point to. It loops. It has always been looping. Every being caught inside it inherited it already turning, the way you inherited a body already breathing before you ever had a single thought about whether to breathe. This is, in its way, a harder thing to accept than almost anything else this night has revealed. Harder even than the sheer scale of the past lives or the weight of suffering rippling across countless beings, because it refuses the one comfort most explanations of suffering eventually offer. A villain, a cause you could in principle remove from the picture and watch everything else resolve. There is no Adam here, no original sin committed by some first being whose mistake gets inherited by everyone after. There is only the chain, and already turning, and the only honest entry point into changing it is wherever you yourself happen to be standing inside the loop right now, which is, in its own strange way, a kind of relief disguised as a difficulty. You do not need to find the beginning of suffering to end your own relationship to it. You only need to find the link in your own immediate experience, where you still have room to choose differently than the chain would otherwise carry you. And here, finally, is the answer to the face. Remember, several hours ago now, in the great unspooling river of countless past lives, one single face surfaced, clear, specific, unexplained, and then vanished again, swept on by the next life and the next, before there was any chance to understand why it mattered. You were asked to keep it in mind. And here's where that promise gets kept. That face was never meant to resolve into a tidy answer. Not a long-lost relative, not a dramatic reveal, not the kind of payoff a more conventional story would have built toward. What the third knowledge shows him instead is something both smaller and far larger than that. That face belonged to a being caught in exactly this same chain. Somewhere far back along his own procession of lives, connected to him not by any special destiny, but by the same ordinary universal mechanism connecting every being to every other being, the same ignorance, the same craving, the same clinging passed forward without anyone choosing it, the way a candle's flame passes to the next candle without either flame ever quite being the same as or entirely separate from the one before it. This is the entire emotional center of what's happening to him right now, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The face mattered exactly as much as every other face he has ever seen, no more, no less, and realizing that, rather than diminishing it, somehow makes the whole vast chain feel suddenly, unbearably personal. Not personal because it was about him specifically. Personal because every single link in it, examined closely enough, turns out to be about someone, some specific being, caught in some specific moment of craving, reaching for relief the only way they knew how. This is dukkha, finally seen whole. Not just suffering in the narrow sense the English word suggests, pain and sadness and loss, but something closer to a fundamental unsatisfactoriness woven through the entire structure of conditioned existence, the way a slightly wrong note woven through an entire piece of music can leave the whole thing subtly, persistently out of tune, even in the passages that sound on the surface perfectly pleasant. This is, perhaps, the single hardest idea in the whole night to translate faithfully into modern language. And because the English word suffering carries connotations of acute, obvious pain that the original term doesn't quite share. Dukkha, in its fuller sense, includes the acute pain of grief and loss, certainly, but it also includes something subtler and in some ways more pervasive. The low, persistent unease that clings even to pleasant experiences, precisely because pleasant experiences are impermanent and therefore can never be fully, permanently rested in. A perfect meal ends. A joyful reunion eventually has to conclude. Even the most secure relationship carries somewhere beneath its surface a quiet awareness that nothing about it is guaranteed to last forever. This is not pessimism. The texts are insistent on that point again and again in ways later interpreters sometimes miss. Noticing this underlying unsatisfactoriness is not the same as concluding that life contains nothing worth living for. It is simply an honest accounting of how conditioned experience actually behaves. Once you stop pretending that holding tightly enough to something pleasant might somehow exempt it from the same impermanence governing everything else, he has seen where it came from. He has seen how far it spreads. And he has now seen, link by link, exactly how it is built. In real time, moment to moment, in every being including himself, right now, even in this very sitting. There is one more thing the chain implies, though, that the texts make clear he does not miss, even in the weight of this hour. If the whole structure depends on each link causing the next, then removing any one link should, in principle, cause the whole structure to fall, not just understanding the chain, breaking it. It's worth noticing which link the tradition eventually identifies as the most practical place to intervene, since the chain itself offers more than one candidate. And you can't simply will ignorance away by deciding not to be ignorant, the way you can't simply decide to stop craving by willpower alone. Both of those links sit too deep in the structure to be approached head-on. But the link between feeling and craving, the moment a pleasant or unpleasant sensation either does or doesn't harden into a reaching toward more or a recoiling away, turns out to be exactly where a steady attention can actually do something. That is, not coincidentally, the precise capacity the four jhanas spent the earlier hours of this night building. The chain has no first link to attack, but it has a hinge, a single joint where a sufficiently steady mind can interrupt momentum before it solidifies into the next link, and then the next, and then the next. Finding that hinge, rather than the impossible task of finding a beginning that doesn't exist, is what the rest of tonight's effort is actually aimed at. That is what the rest of this night is for. The forest is still completely silent. The moon, somewhere behind the branches, has moved far enough now that the deepest dark of the night, the true bottom of it, the hour furthest from both sunset and sunrise, has already passed, though nothing visible has changed yet. There is one more set of fears still to meet, the last and subtlest ones, the ones that don't announce themselves with armies or daughters or roaring wind, because by this point in the night they don't need to. They are far quieter than that, and they are the last things standing between this man and the answer his entire life, and by his own accounting, countless lives before this one have been circling toward. By now you've watched the chain that has no first link reveal itself, watched the unexplained face from hours ago finally settle into place, not as a special destiny, but as one more being caught in the same ordinary machinery as everyone else. He has seen where suffering comes from, how far it spreads, and exactly how it builds itself moment by moment, link by link. And what's left now is the last and quietest test of the entire night. The texts call what remains the asavas, a word that gets translated a few different ways, but the image underneath it is consistent across every version. Something that seeps, the way water seeps slowly through a crack in old stone, or the way a fermenting liquid gives off a slow, continuous vapor. 3 of them, specifically named in the oldest accounts. The fermentation of sensual desire, the fermentation of becoming, that same restless momentum toward the next existence the previous knowledge already traced, and the fermentation of ignorance itself, not seeing, that sits underneath every other link in the whole chain. Here's what most people get wrong about this, and it's an honest mistake, because by this point in the story, it would be reasonable to assume the hardest fighting is long behind him. They imagine the 3 knowledges as a tidy, escalating staircase, each one a little more dramatic than the last, building towards some final fireworks display at the top. That is not quite what the texts describe. If anything, this last stretch is the quietest part of the entire night. No army, no roaring forest, no daughters offering beauty, no vast river of countless lives. Just a man, alone, looking at the very last and subtlest places where craving has been hiding. Notice what's actually being asked of him here, because it's different from everything that came before. Fighting Māra's army required courage. Recollecting countless lives required endurance. Tracing the whole chain of dependent origination required a kind of relentless, patient intelligence. This last stretch requires something quieter than any of those, a willingness to keep looking even after the big dramatic discoveries are already behind you, into the smallest, most stubborn remainders of the very thing you've been trying to understand all night. There's a particular kind of exhaustion worth naming here. The specific exhaustion of having already done the hard part and discovering there's still more left. Anyone who has finished a major undertaking, a difficult exam, a grueling project, a long illness finally past its worst, knows this exhaustion. The crisis has passed, the dramatic part is over. And yet there remains a long, unglamorous tale of smaller tasks still needing to be finished, made harder rather than easier by the fact that everyone, including some part of yourself, already assumes the hard part is done. Sitting beneath the fig tree in these final hours before dawn, having already survived an army, recollected countless lives and traced a chain with no first link, Siddhartha is facing exactly this kind of exhaustion, and the temptation it brings is rarely dramatic. It rarely looks like giving up outright. It looks, instead, like quietly deciding you've already done enough, and that the remaining 10% surely doesn't matter as much as the 90% already behind you. This is the last fear. There won't be another. And it's worth saying plainly what it actually is, because by this hour it has shrunk down to something almost embarrassingly small compared to everything that's come before. Not the fear of an army, not the fear of going unwitnessed, not even the heavy grief of seeing suffering ripple endlessly across every being everywhere, but the simple, ordinary temptation to call this close enough. And to look at everything he has already seen tonight, 3/4 of the way to dawn, exhausted, having already survived more than anyone before him ever had, and decide that this much understanding is surely sufficient. Surely no one would blame him for stopping here. You know this temptation too, even if your own version of it has nothing to do with cosmic liberation. It's the temptation to submit the project that's 90% finished, instead of pushing through the last, most tedious 10%. It's the apology that gets most of the way honest and then softens at the very end, just enough to spare yourself a little discomfort. It's the workout you cut short in the final 2 minutes, telling yourself you already did most of it. The last fermentation is rarely the loudest one. It's usually the quietest, the most reasonable sounding, the easiest to mistake for simply being done. What makes this particular temptation so much more dangerous than the army hours earlier is precisely how little it asks of him. The army demanded a dramatic refusal, a clear and visible act of courage anyone watching would have recognized instantly as significant. This temptation asks for nothing dramatic at all. It simply asks him to accept that almost entirely free is close enough to entirely free, that the difference hardly matters anymore. A difference that on the surface sounds reasonable, even modest, a kind of compromise a tired and exhausted person could make and feel afterward that they'd lost nothing of consequence. It is only in hindsight, after the rest of the night has played out, that the size of what was actually at stake in that final, quiet decision becomes clear. Not a small rounding error in an otherwise complete understanding, but the entire difference between a mind still subtly defended against its own deepest fears and a mind with nothing left anywhere to defend. He does not stop there. According to the Mahāsākaka Sutta, he turns that same steady attention toward these last fermentations directly, not fighting them, not pushing them away the way you might shove aside an unwanted thought, but simply seeing them clearly enough that, once seen completely, they no longer have anywhere left to hide. Sensual desire, looked at fully, reveals itself as a habit built on the third knowledge's own chain. Craving, depending on feeling, depending on contact, already understood, already seen through, with nothing left underneath it to fuel a fresh grasping. Becoming, the restless reach toward the next existence, opened the same way, finds nothing left to push it forward either, the momentum finally running out of road. And ignorance itself, the deepest, oldest fermentation, not seeing that has been quietly running underneath every other link in the chain since before this entire night began, dissolves last, the way the final patch of fog burns off a field once the sun has fully cleared the horizon. This is not memory dissolving. This is not personality dissolving. This is not the capacity to love, to feel joy, not to grieve when grief is warranted, dissolving either. And this distinction matters enormously, because a great deal of confusion about this story, across 2,500 years of retelling, comes from imagining enlightenment as a kind of emotional flattening, a man becoming less human in order to become more awakened. What's actually described dissolving here is something narrower and, in its way, more precise. The thirst underneath all three of those things, the compulsive need to grasp at memory, grasp at identity, grasp at feeling in order to feel real, in order to feel safe, in order to feel like a fixed and continuous self that needs protecting. Take that thirst away, and what's left is not less of a person. It is by every account that follows from this night onward, and a person finally free to love without grasping, to feel without flinching, to grieve without being destroyed by the grieving, because nothing underneath any of it is being defended anymore. And the years that follow this night offer plenty of evidence for this distinction, if you know where to look for it. The man who walks away from this tree weeps, by some accounts, at the news of his two old teachers' deaths. He grieves, later in life, at the loss of close disciples, including, eventually, two of his closest students dying before he himself does. None of that reads as the behavior of someone who has flattened his own capacity to feel. What changed, the texts consistently suggest, was not his ability to love or grieve, but the desperate, fearful grip that so often distorts love and grief in less awakened minds. The grasping that turns ordinary loss into catastrophe, ordinary affection into possessive fear of losing what's loved. Remove that grip, and what remains is not a smaller capacity for feeling. It is feeling, finally, without the extra weight of fighting to keep it. Here's the part the statues never show you. Here at the very end of this last fermentation, there is, by most accounts, no single dramatic instant where this happens. No flash, no thunderclap, no choir of unseen voices. The texts describe it the way you'd describe the last knot in a long, tangled rope finally working itself loose, not with a sudden snap, but with a kind of quiet, almost anticlimactic release. The rope simply lying flat where, a moment before, it had been wound impossibly tight. It's worth dwelling on that image a little longer, because it captures something true about how most real change actually happens, in this story and in ordinary life both. We tend, culturally, not to expect transformation to announce itself. A single decisive scene, a clear before and after, a moment you could point to on a calendar and say, that was the day everything changed. But anyone who has actually worked through something difficult in their own life, grief, a long illness, a habit they were finally ready to release, knows that the felt experience of change rarely arrives that cleanly. It arrives the way this final fermentation arrives, as the last in a long series of knots, most of them already loosened earlier, this one simply being the final one left, no more or less significant in itself than the dozens that came before it, except that it happens to be the last one standing between effort and rest. The drama, if there is any, belongs to the whole sequence, not to this one final, quiet, anticlimactic release. And somewhere during this final, quietest stretch of effort, without any single moment anyone could point to and call the precise instant it happened, the sky over the Niranjana begins almost imperceptibly at first to change. Not light yet, not anything you could call dawn, just the faintest possible loosening of the absolute black that has held the sky since shortly after sunset, the kind of change you'd only notice if you had been sitting, facing east, paying the closest possible attention, for the entire night. He has been. Pay attention to where his hand goes one more time here, because it tells you something important about how undramatic the actual turning point of this entire night really is. It does not move at all. No gesture marks this moment, the way the earth touching marked the end of the first watch. He simply continues sitting exactly as he has been sitting for hours, hand resting lightly on his knee, attention steady, while the last fermentation finishes dissolving and the eastern sky, degree by degree, begins its long, slow climb toward morning. There's something fitting in the fact that the single most consequential moment in this entire night arrives with no outward marker at all, after a night that began with a dramatic vow, included an army, a hand touching the ground, and a vast unspooling river of countless lives. The biggest turning point of all turns out to be the quietest one. No gesture, no sound, no visible change in posture, nothing a passing observer, had one happened to wander by at exactly this moment, could possibly have noticed. If you were looking for a single image to summarize what this entire story is actually claiming about how real transformation tends to happen, you could do worse than this one. Not a flash, not a gesture, not even a moment dramatic enough to paint, but a man sitting exactly as he had been sitting. while something finished happening inside him that the whole rest of human history would eventually trace back to this exact, undramatic, unmarked moment. If this story is landing for you, if you're the kind of person willing to sit through an entire night this carefully, rather than skipping straight to the ending, that's exactly the kind of attention this channel is built around, and subscribing helps more people find stories told at this pace, instead of rushed past in 30 seconds. The night is not over. There is one more thing still to happen, the thing every painting of this story tries and fails not to fully capture. The moment 3 watches of effort, 3 knowledges, and 1 entire lifetime of searching finally arrive at first light. But the hardest work by every account that survives is already finished, and what's left now is simply for the sky to catch up with what has already, quietly, completely become true inside him. By now you've watched the last and quietest fermentation finish dissolving. Watch the eastern sky begin its first imperceptible loosening from absolute black, while a man who has not moved in hours sits perfectly still, waiting for the morning to catch up with what has already silently become true inside him. It does. The exact moment is impossible to pin to a single breath, the way dawn always is. You never quite catch the instant night becomes day, only notice sometime after that it already has none. But by every account that survives, somewhere as the very first direct light of the full moon morning touches the horizon, full awakening completes. Not a new knowledge arriving, not another fermentation found and dissolved, simply this. Nothing left unseen, nothing left ungrasped, nothing left unfinished in the search that began 6 years earlier with a man walking away from a sleeping wife and son in the dark. He is no longer Siddhartha Gautama, prince of a small kingdom, seeker among seekers. The text will give him many titles in the years that follow. The Buddha, the awakened one, the Tathagata, the one who has gone thus, a strange and deliberately humble title that refuses to claim anything more than simply having arrived at things as they actually are. But in this first hour, before any of those titles exist yet, before a single other living person knows anything has happened at all, there is just a man sitting under a tree at dawn, breathing, and noticing that the entire weight he has carried his whole life, and by his own seeing this very night, countless lives before this one, is simply gone. According to the Udana, the earliest collection of his spontaneous utterances, what comes out of him in this moment is not a lecture. It is not even strictly a teaching. It is closer to what anyone might say after finally setting down something unbearably heavy they'd carried so long they'd forgotten it was possible to put it down at all. A few short verses of pure, uncomplicated joy, a kind of utterance the texts call udana, meaning something like an exclamation. A sound that simply escapes a person rather than one they carefully composed. And tradition holds that among the very first things he ever puts into words as an awakened being are these. Not commandments, not doctrine, but something closer to a sigh of profound relief, later remembered and passed down as the Dhammapada's house builder verses. Through countless births I wandered, seeking the builder of this house and not finding him, and painful is birth again and again. But now, house builder, you are seen. You will not build this house again. Your rafters are broken, your ridgepole is shattered. This mind has reached the unconditioned. The craving that built every house has come to its end. And notice what's actually being said here, underneath the poetry, because it connects directly back to everything you've watched unfold over the last several hours. The house in this image is not a building at all, and it's a life. Each existence a structure built beam by craving and torn down again at death, only to be rebuilt almost identically by the same craving in the next life and the next, exactly the pattern the first knowledge revealed, sweeping back through countless past existences. What he's saying in this first breath of awakened life is not a doctrine. It's closer to an address, spoken almost playfully, to the builder itself, the way you might finally speak directly to a habit you've spent your whole life fighting blindly. Now that you can finally see its face, I see you. I know exactly how you've worked every single time, and you won't be building anything else. Not for me, not ever again. It's worth noticing, too, how precisely this image lines up with the chain you'll watch him trace several hours from now. The deepest part of this same night, the same craving identified here as the house builder reappears later as one specific link in a much longer chain. The same force wearing different names depending on which angle the night's understanding happens to be approaching it from. The house builder verses arrive first, as a spontaneous cry of relief. The chain arrives later, as a careful, methodical tracing of exactly how that same builder does its work, link by link, from ignorance all the way down to old age and death. Both are describing the same discovery. One is the feeling of it, the other is the mechanism. This is not the language of triumph over an enemy. There's no gloating in it, no relish of victory the way a soldier might relish defeating an opponent. If anything, the tone is closer to a quiet, almost tender recognition, the way you might finally name, out loud after years of confusion, the exact shape of something that has been quietly running your whole life, and feel in the naming itself, a thing finally loosen its grip. It's worth knowing that these particular verses went on to become some of the most frequently recited lines in the entire later tradition, memorized by monks and lay people alike across every Buddhist culture that followed. Often among the very first verses a new student learns by heart. There is something fitting in that afterlife, given what the verses themselves are actually describing. The very first words spoken by an awakened being became, for everyone who came after him, words spoken back to their own craving, borrowed generation after generation by people facing their own much smaller version of the same recognition, addressing their own house builder in their own quieter, more ordinary nights, long after the man who first spoke them had died. And here's where the story usually jumps straight to triumph, straight to teaching, straight to the famous sermon at Sarnath everyone has at least heard fragments of. But that's not what actually happens next. What actually happens next, according to every major tradition's account, is something far stranger and far more human. He stays exactly where he is, for weeks. The traditions describe 7 distinct weeks spent in the immediate area around the tree, moving by most accounts from spot to spot nearby, sometimes sitting in continued absorption, sometimes simply walking back and forth along a path near the tree, sometimes, in one well-loved account, sheltered from a sudden week of storms by a great serpent king who coiled himself protectively around the seated figure to keep the rain off. We are not going to walk through all 7 weeks in detail. That's a story for another time. But it's worth knowing they happened because of what comes at the very end of them. It's worth pausing, even briefly, on what those 7 weeks actually represent, because they tell you something about the difference between an instant of insight and the slower work of letting an insight fully settle into a life. The understanding itself had already arrived, complete, at dawn. But understanding something completely and living inside that understanding so thoroughly that it shapes every subsequent choice are not quite the same thing. And the tradition seems to know this, which is presumably why it insists on these 7 weeks rather than simply moving directly from the dawn to the decision to teach. He walks, he sits. He is sheltered from a storm by a serpent who, by some accounts, becomes so moved by the experience of protecting him that the encounter is remembered as the Serpent King's own small turning point. Nothing about these weeks is described as urgent. There is no rush to announce what has happened, no impulse to immediately go find an audience. The understanding is simply allowed to settle, the way a stirred pool of water is allowed to settle until it goes perfectly still and clear before anyone tries to see their own reflection in it. Because somewhere near the close of those weeks, as sitting with the full weight of everything he now understood, a question arose in him that the texts treat with surprising honesty, given how the story usually gets told afterward. Should he even bother trying to teach any of this to anyone else at all? This is the part most retellings skip past entirely, eager to get to the triumphant sermon, but it's one of the most important moments in the whole arc of this story. According to the Aripariyasana Sutta, the Noble Search, he reasoned with himself that what he had seen, this deep, this subtle, this fundamentally countercurrent to almost everything most people spend their lives chasing, would be exceptionally difficult to communicate. People are, by and large, deeply attached to craving, deeply invested in exactly the patterns he had just spent an entire night, and by his own account, countless lifetimes, dissolving, trying to explain something this subtle to minds that comfortable in the opposite direction felt, for a moment, like it might simply be wasted effort, exhausting, possibly futile. And here's where, depending on which tradition you follow, something remarkable interrupts that hesitation. A being named Brahma Sahampati, described across the early texts as a high deity from a refined heavenly realm, perceiving this exact moment of doubt from wherever such beings dwell, and descending specifically to intervene. Whatever you make of that literally, a genuine divine visitation or the dramatized voice of his own deepest compassion finally answering his own deepest fatigue. The content of the plea is recorded with remarkable consistency. Please teach. There are beings somewhere in the world with only a little dust in their eyes who will understand if given the chance and who will be lost forever if no one ever shows them the way. And it's worth treating both readings of this episode with equal seriousness rather than rushing to settle the question one way or the other, because the texts themselves don't seem especially anxious to settle it either. The earliest layers of the tradition are comfortable holding a being like Brahma Sahampati as genuinely real, a figure operating in a cosmology that included multiple realms and multiple kinds of beings well above and below the human level. There is no indication that the original audience hearing this story would have found a divine intervention here strange or in need of special justification. At the same time, the structure of the scene, hesitation, followed by exactly the argument that would resolve the hesitation, arriving from outside at precisely the right moment, maps so cleanly onto how an internal change of heart often actually unfolds that many later readers, including some within the tradition itself, have found it equally natural to read Brahma's appearance as a dramatized externalization of the Buddha's own compassion, finally outweighing his own exhaustion. And the story does not require you to choose. It simply asks you to notice that hesitation, however it gets resolved, is part of the record, even at this moment, even for him. Hold that phrase. Someone, somewhere, will understand. We are coming back to it directly, because it is about to be tested against 5 very specific, very skeptical men a long walk from here, and the answer to whether it's true is going to matter more than almost anything else in this entire story. According to the account, the Buddha, and we can use that title now, finally, without it sounding premature, surveys the world with that same divine eye the second knowledge gave him, and sees scattered across it beings at every level of readiness, some hopelessly entangled, some already nearly free, and a meaningful number genuinely capable of understanding if only someone were willing to make the long, difficult effort of explaining it to them. The traditional image used to describe this survey is worth holding on to because it does something a plain statement of statistics never could. It compares the beings he sees to lotus flowers growing in a pond, at every possible stage of growth. Some remain entirely submerged beneath the water's surface, their petals not yet ready to open no matter how much light reaches them. Some have grown close enough to the surface that they sit right at the waterline, neither fully under nor fully free, needing only a little more time before they breach into open air. And some have already broken the surface entirely, standing clear of the water, untouched by it, needing nothing further but the warmth of direct sunlight to open completely. It is this last group, and a meaningful portion of the group just beneath them at the waterline, that the survey reveals are ready right now for exactly the kind of explanation he has spent one entire night discovering how to give. He decides to try. It's a quietly significant decision, easy to read past in a single short sentence after everything more dramatic that's already happened tonight. Mind that had just spent one entire night dissolving every last trace of its own craving, had no remaining personal stake in whether anyone else ever understood any of it. There was nothing left in him that needed an audience, a legacy, a following, in order to feel complete. And he decides to try anyway, not because the teaching needed to happen for his own sake, but simply because the lotus flowers sitting at the waterline were there and waiting, whether or not he ever went looking for them. And the first people he thinks of, the texts are very specific about this, are not strangers. They are two men who already came astonishingly close to the truth themselves years ago. Māra, Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, the very teachers whose impressive but incomplete attainments he outgrew before this night ever began. Surveying the world again with his new clarity, he discovers, what the texts describe as Jin sorrow, that both men have already died. Kalama 7 days earlier, Uddaka only the night before. Both came close, both ran out of time before the final piece arrived. This is not a story that ends in easy triumph, not even here, at what should be the most purely joyful moment of the entire account. And there is real grief folded into it. Two men who spent their whole lives in exactly the right direction, missing the final breakthrough by what amounts, on the scale of a whole existence, to almost nothing at all. None. So he thinks instead of 5 other men, ascetics he once practiced alongside during the hardest years of his own self-starvation, men who watched him eventually abandon that path and walk away to eat a bowl of milk rice from a village woman, and who concluded, watching him go, that he had simply given up, that he had failed where they were still determined to succeed. They are camped, he learns, nearly 200 miles from where he is sitting right now, near a town called Isipatana, close to what people today call Sarnath. It begins almost immediately to walk. By now you've watched dawn finally arrive after an entire night of fighting, seeing, and finally quietly finishing. Watched the first words ever spoken by an awakened being turn out to be a kind of relieved address to an old, exhausted habit rather than a grand declaration. And you've watched 2 old teachers miss the breakthrough by mere days, and watched a newly awakened man decide, against real hesitation, to try anyway. Now he is walking, nearly 200 miles on foot, toward 5 men who already believe he failed. Let's be honest about the scale of that decision for a moment, because it's easy to read past it too quickly on the way to the famous sermon everyone already half knows is coming. And 200 miles in the heat of an Indian summer approaching, on foot with no guarantee of welcome at the other end, in fact with every reason to expect the opposite. The last time these 5 men saw him, he was abandoning the practice they all shared, eating food after years of starvation, doing the one thing in their eyes that marked him as someone who had given up. And it helps to understand what that shared practice actually demanded, in order to understand exactly how severe their judgment of him would have been. And ascetic communities scattered through the forests of this region in this era competed, in a sense, on the basis of austerity. How little food, how little sleep, how much physical hardship a practitioner could endure, on the theory that the body's comforts were precisely what kept the mind chained to craving. To watch a fellow ascetic abandon that discipline, accept a generous meal from a village woman, and walk off in a different direction entirely would have looked, to 5 men who had built their entire identity and daily practice around extreme self-denial, like nothing short of failure, confirmation that the search itself had simply proven too difficult for him, and that he'd taken the easier road most seekers eventually take when the harder one doesn't pay off. You know this kind of walk too, even if yours has never covered 200 miles. It's the drive back to a hometown you left under difficult circumstances, to face people who watched you fail at something publicly. And it's the return to a group chat, A family gathering, a former workplace where you already know exactly what some of the faces are going to say before you even arrive, and going anyway. Because something matters more than the discomfort of being misunderstood one more time. He walks anyway. Along the way, the texts include a small, almost throwaway encounter that's easy to skip past but worth pausing on, because it tells you something honest about how the world actually receives news this large at first. A wandering ascetic named Upaka passes him on the road and, struck by something unusual in his bearing, a clarity, a stillness, not something visibly different, asks who his teacher is under whom he trained. The Buddha's answer, as the text's recorded, is startling in its directness. I have no teacher. I have awakened completely by myself, with no one's help. Upaka, hearing this, simply shakes his head, says something non-committal, may it be so, and walks on in the opposite direction, unconvinced, uninterested in following up. And this is the part the statues never show you, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The very first person ever to hear, directly, in plain language, that full awakening had occurred, simply doesn't believe it, and walks away. No drama, no confrontation, just a shrug, and the road continuing on without him. There's something almost comic in a quiet, sobering way about how this particular exchange is preserved at all. Most traditions, not telling the story of their founder's first announcement of what had happened, would have every reason to leave out an encounter that ends in flat indifference. That this moment survives it all, recorded honestly, no attempt to soften the rejection or supply Upaka with a change of heart he apparently never had, tells you something about the texture of the entire textual tradition behind this story. It does not appear to have been edited primarily for inspiration. Later tradition does record, almost as an afterthought, that Upaka eventually went on to live a difficult life, and that some accounts suggest he encountered the teaching again much later and finally did come to understand it, though by then with far less fanfare than a man meeting the newly awakened Buddha on an open road might have hoped to receive. Whether or not that later encounter is historical, the first one is preserved exactly as it apparently happened. An enormous truth, spoken plainly, met with a shrug, by someone with no particular reason to doubt it beyond the simple, ordinary human habit of not believing extraordinary claims from strangers on the road. This is not a story about everyone instantly recognizing greatness the moment it appears. This is not a story about the world rushing forward to celebrate truth the instant it's spoken. This is not a story about an easy, welcoming reception waiting at the end of a long and difficult night. This is a story about truth arriving mostly to indifference and someone choosing to keep walking anyway toward 5 people who have an actual grudge against him. Rather than turning back simply because one passing stranger didn't care. Eventually, after what the text suggests is several weeks of walking, he arrives at Isapatana, near a deer park outside the town now known as Sarnath, and in the distance he sees them. The 5 ascetics he once practiced alongside through the hardest, most extreme years of his self-starvation, the men who watched him walk away from that path and concluded, without much room left for any other interpretation, that he had simply lost his nerve. This is the part every version of the story records in roughly the same shape across every tradition that preserves it. Seeing him approaching, the 5 men agree among themselves quietly before he arrives on exactly how to treat him. Not warmly, not as an honored guest, they decide deliberately to offer him only the bare minimum courtesy a wandering ascetic is owed by custom. A seat perhaps, a basic greeting, nothing more. No respect beyond what tradition strictly requires, as far as they're concerned, and this is a man who gave up, returning for reasons unclear, to the very community he abandoned. You can imagine, easily enough, what this would feel like from the other side. After everything, the army, the daughters, the entire weight of countless lives seen clearly, the chain with no first link finally understood and broken. walking the last stretch of road toward 5 old friends, hoping, presumably, for some kind of welcome, and watching their faces arrange themselves deliberately into cool, careful neutrality before he's even close enough to speak. But something happens that none of them planned for, and none of them can fully explain afterward. And as he draws closer, the agreed-upon coolness simply fails. One by one, almost despite themselves, the 5 men find themselves rising to greet him properly anyway, taking his bowl and robe, offering him water for his feet, addressing him with titles of respect they had specifically agreed only moments earlier not to use. The texts don't dwell on exactly why the plan collapsed. They simply note that it did, as if something about his bearing made the agreed-upon coldness impossible to sustain once he was actually standing in front of them. He tells them directly, without preamble, that he has, in fact, awakened, that the search is complete, and here predictably is where their old skepticism resurfaces, sharper this time because it's specific. You couldn't even keep the ascetic practices we all agreed mattered. You ate food. You gave up the hard path. How could someone who quit possibly have found what the rest of us are still struggling toward? This is where the night you've spent the last 11 chapters living through finally gets its first real test outside his own mind. Everything that happened under that tree, real to him beyond any possible doubt, witnessed by nothing but the earth itself, now has to survive contact with 5 skeptical, unconvinced men who have every reason, personal and ideological both, to dismiss it. He answers them, according to the Aryapariyasana Sutta, with a simple, almost disarming question of his own. Have I ever spoken to you this way before? Have you ever, in all our years together, heard me make this kind of claim, this directly, without hedging? They admit, somewhat reluctantly, that they have not. He never once, in their years of shared practice, claimed any attainment he hadn't actually reached. According to some versions of this exchange, the 5 men actually push back twice more before finally relenting, each time receiving the same patient, unembellished version of the same answer. Not a longer argument, not an escalating appeal to authority, and simply the same quiet question restated. Have I ever claimed this kind of thing to you before, without it being true? The repetition itself seems to matter. A claim defended by increasingly elaborate justification tends, if anything, to invite more suspicion, not less. The harder someone argues for their own credibility, the more it can start to look like compensation for something missing. And what apparently moves these 5 skeptical men is the opposite. A man not arguing harder, simply repeating calmly the one small, verifiable fact already sitting between them, and trusting that fact eventually to do the work no amount of additional persuasion could. It is a small moment. It does not look like much on the page, but it is in its own quiet way the entire weight of the night finally beginning to press, very gently, against the wall of someone else's doubt. Not with force, not with argument, but with the simple accumulated fact of a man who has never once lied to them before, asking them now to extend the same trust one more time. Now, it's worth noticing what he doesn't do here, because the restraint is as telling as the argument itself. He does not describe the army. He does not describe the 3 knowledges, the chain with no first link, the dawn. He does not ask them to take any of it on faith, or appeal to anything they cannot independently verify about him. He appeals only to the one thing they already know firsthand, from years of shared practice, that whatever else might be true about this strange transformed version of their old companion, he has never, in their direct experience of him, claimed anything he hadn't earned. That is a remarkably small, modest foundation on which to ask 5 skeptical men to set aside years of accumulated judgment about his apparent failure. And it works, not because it is rhetorically clever, but because it is true, and because true things, stated plainly by someone with no history of lying, tend to carry a weight that elaborate persuasion never quite manages on its own. If this story has held you this long, through the army, through the chain, and through the long walk to this exact moment, That's exactly the kind of patient attention this channel is built around, and it's worth subscribing if you want more stories told at this pace, the long way on, instead of rushed past in search of a quicker payoff. And here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when you had to ask someone to trust something about you they had every good reason based on the past to doubt? What did it take to actually convince them? I'd genuinely like to hear it below. The 5 men, still not fully convinced, but no longer entirely closed either, agree to listen. The sun is beginning to lower over the deer park at Isipatana, and the words that are about to be spoken there, quietly, to exactly 5 skeptical men sitting in a park most of the world has still never heard of, are about to travel further and faster and longer than almost any word spoken anywhere in human history. By now you've watched 5 skeptical men nearly fail to keep their own planned coldness, watched their old certainty about his failure start to crack against the simple, accumulated fact of a man who never once lied to them before. The sun is lowering over the deer park at Isipatana. They have agreed cautiously to listen. What he is about to say to them is about to become, within a few centuries, a single most repeated teaching in human history. And right now, in this exact moment, it is being spoken out loud by anyone for the very first time. None. The text call what follows the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the setting in motion of the wheel of the teaching Dhammacakka. We're not going to walk through every line of it here. That sermon deserves and has received elsewhere not its own full telling. But it's worth understanding the shape of what he gives them, because the shape itself answers something that's been building across this entire night. He does not begin with the 3 knowledges. He does not describe the army, the river, the earth-touching, the long unspooling chain of dependent origination you've just spent several chapters walking through with him. And he begins instead with something almost shockingly simple, distilled down from an entire night, and by his own account, countless lifetimes, into 4 plain statements anyone can test against their own experience without needing to take anything on faith at all. There is suffering. There is a cause for that suffering. There is an end to that suffering, and there is a path that leads to that end. That's it. 4 truths stated almost like a diagnosis, a doctor naming a condition, naming its cause, confirming a cure exists, and describing the treatment. No mythology required. No claim demanding belief in anything unverifiable. Just an invitation to look the same way he looked all night at his own direct experience and see whether it matches. No, it's worth noticing how deliberately practical this structure is compared to everything you've watched unfold across the rest of this night. He could have opened with the 3 knowledges. He could have opened with the chain of dependent origination, the army, the earth-touching, any of the vast dramatic material that makes up the bulk of what actually happened under the tree. Instead, faced with exactly the kind of skeptical, practically minded audience 5 hardened ascetics represent, he opens with the part of the night's understanding, requiring the least amount of trust in anything they couldn't check for themselves. Suffering exists. They already know this intimately, and from years of their own difficult practice. It has a cause, a claim they can test against their own experience rather than simply accept on his word. An end to it is possible, and there is a specific path toward that end, everything more elaborate. The past lives, the divine eye, the chain with no first link, could come later, built on a foundation these 5 men had already, by the end of this one sermon, started to verify for themselves. Here's the part that traveled the farthest, the fastest, of everything spoken in this entire story. Further than the army, further than the 3 knowledges, further even than the house builder verses spoken alone at dawn with no one listening. Because something happens partway through this teaching to one of the 5 men in particular. His name is Kondanya, the eldest of the 5, the one the others had by tradition looked to first for judgment on matters like this, and as the teaching unfolds, something in him simply opens. The texts describe it plainly, almost casually. Given how enormous a moment it actually is. Dust-free, stainless, the vision of truth arose in him. A phrase the tradition will use again and again in the centuries that follow, for anyone who reaches this same first taste of what the Buddha saw completely that night under the tree. Notice what's happening here, because it connects directly back to something planted in the story hours ago. Before any of this walking, before the long 200-mile road, before even the decision to teach at all. Remember Brahma Sahampati's plea back near the tree. There are beings somewhere with only a little dust in their eyes. Who will understand if given the chance? That was not a comfortable guarantee. It was a hope offered against real hesitation, with no certainty attached to it. Weeks of walking, one disinterested stranger on the road, and 5 men who had specifically planned to treat him coolly stand between that hope and this moment, and it's worth letting the distance between them register fully before moving on. A lesser story, eager to flatter its own central claim, might have skipped the indifferent stranger, skipped the planned coolness, and arrived at confirmation more quickly and more comfortably. This story does not, and it makes you walk the same uncertain road he walked, doubting along with him whether the hope Brahma offered would actually hold up against real, skeptical, unconvinced human beings, and only then, after every reason for doubt has been given its full weight, delivers the answer. Here in a deer park at Isipatana, sitting across from 5 skeptical men who had specifically planned to treat him coolly only hours before, that hope is answered. Someone, somewhere did understand. The Buddha, seeing the change in Kondanya's face, is recorded as speaking a single short exclamation almost involuntarily, the same kind of spontaneous udana that marked his own awakening at dawn weeks earlier. Kondanyo truly has understood. Kondanyo truly has understood. And from that exclamation, tradition says, Kondanya received a new name that stayed with him the rest of his life. Anya Kondanya, Kondanya who understood. It's worth noting how unusual it is, within the broader sweep of this entire account, for the Buddha to be recorded reacting this openly to anything. Across 4.5 decades of subsequent teaching, the texts generally describe a figure of remarkable composure, rarely shown expressing surprise, excitement, or relief in any unguarded way, even in circumstances that might seem to call for it. This single exclamation, repeated twice in quick succession, stands out precisely because of how rare this kind of unguarded reaction is elsewhere in the record. Whatever else this moment represents historically and doctrinally, it also represents something quietly human. A teacher, after years of searching and one entire night of solitary effort, finally watching someone else's face change in exactly the way he had hoped it might, and for one brief recorded moment, simply unable to contain how much that mattered to him. This is the moment the whole long architecture of this night, the army, the river, the chain, the last quiet fermentation dissolving just before dawn, finally proves itself transferable. Not just true for one man alone, under one tree, unwitnessed by anyone but the earth itself. True in a way that another mind, given the right words and the right willingness to listen, could actually receive and recognize for himself. It's worth sitting with how much was actually riding on this single moment, because if Kondanya's understanding had not arrived, if the 4 truths, however carefully explained, had simply bounced off 5 skeptical minds the way the same kind of explanation bounces off most people most of the time, the entire shape of what followed would have been thrown into serious doubt. Māra's old question, the one answered hours earlier with nothing more than a hand touching the ground, would have resurfaced in a far more practical, far less easily dismissed form. Not, will anyone ever believe this happened, but, can this actually be taught to anyone else at all, or was it only ever going to be true for the one mind that happened to have spent an entire night discovering it? Kondanya's understanding does not just convert one skeptical ascetic. It answers in the most concrete and verifiable way available, a deepest fear Māra raised in the very first watch of this whole long night. And it answers it not with another vision, another piece of private, unwitnessed seeing, but with a second human mind, none sitting in broad daylight in a public deer park, independently arriving at the same understanding through nothing more exotic than careful explanation and careful listening. We are going to take you back very briefly, where this story began. To a riverbank near Kusinara, 45 years from this exact moment in the deer park, where an old monk named Ananda is kneeling beside a dying body, finally asking the question he swallowed for almost half a century. What was it actually like in there that whole night alone? Here finally is the shape of the answer, not delivered all at once in one tidy sentence, but assembled the way the Buddha himself assembled it for Ananda and for every other disciple across 4.5 decades of teaching, out of exactly the pieces you've spent this whole video walking through. It was not lightning. It was not a single instant of grace arriving from outside, uninvited, unearned. It was patience, watch after watch, fear after fear, faced without flinching, until there was nothing left standing between him and what had always, quietly, already been true. Ananda receives that answer in the text the way it has always been transmitted, not as a private secret reserved only for him, but as the same teaching offered freely to anyone willing to sit still long enough to actually hear it. The same teaching Kondanya received first, in this exact deer park, decades earlier, while 4 other men sat beside him, not still listening, not quite there yet themselves. With it, by most accounts, all 5 eventually reached the same understanding Kondanya reached first. Vapa, then Badya, then Mahanama, then Asaji, one after another, a small, skeptical community that had once watched him walk away in apparent failure becoming. Instead, the first 5 members of a community the texts will start calling the Sangha. What's happening underneath this fear turned into understanding runs deeper than a simple happy ending, though, and it's worth naming plainly before we move forward in time. This was never going to stop with 5 men in one deer park. Within months, the texts describe a quiet, steady accumulation that starts to look less like 5 conversions and more like a current finding its way downhill. A wealthy young man named Yasa, disillusioned with a life of pleasure that had stopped meaning anything to him, joins. His friends follow. A brilliant wandering teacher named Sariputta, already renowned for his sharp mind. Here's a single 4-line verse repeated secondhand by one of the original 5 ascetics. Just 4 lines about causes and their cessation, and reportedly attains the first taste of understanding before he has even met the Buddha in person, simply from hearing the shape of the teaching repeated by someone else. The story of exactly how Sariputta encountered that verse is worth a moment's attention, because of how unremarkable the setting was for something that would go on to matter this much. He was, by most accounts, already an accomplished spiritual seeker himself, well-known and well-respected, walking through a city street on entirely ordinary business, when he happened to notice one of the original 5, Asaji, by most tellings, walking with an unusual, settled calm, the same kind of calm Upaka had noticed in the Buddha himself and dismissed without a second thought along the road to Sarnath. Sariputta, unlike Upaka, stopped to ask. Asaji, by his own modest account, claimed he was too new to the teaching to explain it well, and offered only a short summary verse he'd memorized, that all things arising from causes also cease when those causes cease. That this was the whole of what his teacher taught. 4 lines, a street corner, a man too humble to claim he fully understood what he was reciting. And from that small, almost accidental exchange, one of the most influential minds in the entire later tradition took his first real step toward everything that followed. His closest friend, Mahamoggalana, follows him within days. A wealthy merchant named Anathapindika, deeply moved by what he hears, will go on to purchase an entire grove of land at enormous personal expense specifically to build a place for this growing community to stay. That last detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because of how ordinary its origin actually was. Anathapindika, by tradition, first heard of the teaching not through any grand public event, but through a chance conversation while visiting relatives away. Most of us first hear about something that ends up mattering enormously in our lives, not through a dramatic announcement, but through a friend mentioning something in passing that we almost don't bother following up on. He sought the Buddha out the very next morning, before sunrise, reportedly so eager that he set out while it was still too dark to see the road clearly. What he heard convinced him completely, and within a short time he was negotiating to purchase a grove of land near the city of Savatthi from a prince who, in one version of the story, set an absurdly high price specifically to discourage the sale, only to be startled when Anathapindika agreed to pay it without hesitation, covering the entire grove in laid-out gold coins to meet the asking price. That grove, called Jetavana, would go on to become one of the most important sites in the entire tradition, a direct, traceable consequence of one merchant's chance conversation, multiplied outward exactly the way Kondanya's single moment of understanding in the deer park was already multiplying outward, link by link, person by person, the same way Kama itself, the second knowledge, had shown, ripples forward without anyone fully controlling where it goes. None of that has happened yet on this particular evening in the deer park. Right now it is simply 5 men, then 4, then 3, then 2, then within days, none. All of them eventually understanding, one by one, the same thing Kondanya understood first in the fading light of that first sermon. If a moment like Kondanya's lands for you, the specific relief of finally being understood by someone who took the time to actually explain something patiently instead of rushing past you, that's worth sitting with for a second. Has anyone ever explained something to you with that kind of patience, at exactly the moment you needed it? Tell me about that person below. There's one more thread worth pulling forward before we close this chapter, because it tells you something about how far this single night under one tree was eventually going to travel. Centuries after this evening in the deer park, a king named Ashoka, a man who built his early reign on conquest and bloodshed on a scale that genuinely horrified even his contemporaries, will undergo his own transformation, far less peaceful in its early stages than anything you've watched tonight, and will eventually walk, by some accounts barefoot, on pilgrimage to the very spot where this whole story started, the fig tree by the Niranjana. Still standing, still rooted in the same ground the Buddha's hand once touched to call the earth as witness. We're going to walk that thread all the way to the present day in the chapter ahead, because the tree, remarkably, is still there. By now you've watched Kondanya's understanding ripple outward into 4 more men, then a wealthy, disillusioned young man, then a brilliant wandering teacher and his closest friend, and a merchant willing to spend a fortune on land just to give this community a place to stay. A single night under one tree has, within a matter of months, stopped being a private event and started becoming something that moves on its own, through other people, the way fire moves through dry grass once it's finally caught. Now watch how far it actually traveled, roughly 250 years after that night by the Niranjana. A king named Ashoka sits on the throne of an empire that, by this point, stretches across most of the Indian subcontinent. An empire he built, its early years, through campaigns of conquest brutal enough that even the court records of his own dynasty don't fully soften the details. One particular campaign against a kingdom called Kalinga is described in his own later inscriptions with a kind of horror that reads almost like confession. Tens of thousands killed, tens of thousands more deported, an entire region left in ruin, and according to the inscriptions Ashoka himself ordered carved into rock and pillar across his empire. Among the oldest surviving written records connected to this entire story, something in him breaks open, not unlike the way something broke open in 5 skeptical ascetics centuries earlier. He converts, not gradually, not quietly, but completely publicly in a way that reshapes the rest of his reign. He renounces further conquest, builds hospitals, wells, shade trees along the roads for travelers, and he makes a pilgrimage, on foot, by most accounts, the same way the Buddha himself once walked 200 miles to 5 doubting men, to the exact spot where this entire story began. What makes Ashoka's inscriptions so remarkable as historical documents is how unusually candid they are for the self-presentation of a ruling monarch in any era, ancient or modern. Kings, as a general rule, not carve confessions of their own moral failure into permanent stone for every subject in the empire to read. Ashoka's Kalinga edict does almost exactly that, describing the suffering he caused in language that reads, even now, as a man genuinely wrestling with what he had done, rather than as triumphant propaganda dressed up as remorse. He goes on, in edicts scattered from what is now Afghanistan in the west to the southern tip of the Indian peninsula, to instruct his officials in the careful, humane treatment of prisoners, the protection of animals, religious tolerances toward every tradition practiced within his territory, and the planting of fruit trees and rest houses along the roads, specifically for the comfort of travelers who were strangers to him and would likely never know his name. It is difficult to find another ruler from the ancient world who left behind anything quite like it. The fig tree is still there. This is the part the texts agree on almost word for word, regardless of which ancient record you read. Ashoka, the inscriptions say, didn't simply visit the site. He built a shrine around the tree itself, the same descendant of the original fig tree, grown from its own roots in the same soil beside the same slow river, and he is recorded as showing it a kind of devotion that startled even his own court. At one point, according to later legend, becoming so attached to visiting it that one of his wives, in a moment of jealousy, allegedly had it cut down, only for it to be revived and replanted from its own surviving roots. Centuries later still, a Chinese monk named Faxian, traveling on pilgrimage in the early 5th century, records visiting the site and finding the tree's descendants still standing, already venerated, already a place where travelers from distant lands came specifically to sit, however briefly, in the shade of something connected directly back to that one night. And then, roughly 2 centuries after Faxian, another Chinese pilgrim named Xuanzang, whose own 17-year overland journey across Central Asia and India remains one of the great travel accounts in human history, arrives at the same spot and describes in careful, specific detail a tree he calls the Bodhi tree, surrounded by a high brick wall, still alive, still rooted in the same ground, nearly 1,000 years after the night you spent this entire video walking through. Zhang's record is worth lingering on a little longer than the others, because of how specific and how clearly eyewitness it actually is. He describes the wall built around the tree to protect it, the height of the tree itself, a particular shape of its leaves, and the local custom, still practiced in his time, of monks and pilgrims measuring the tree's height each year against a fixed point, as if half expecting or perhaps half hoping that it might somehow keep growing forever. He records, too, a piece of local tradition holding that the tree's size would shrink whenever the broader fortunes of the teaching declined in the region, and grow again when devotion to it returned. Folklore, certainly, rather than botany, but folklore that tells you plainly how thoroughly this single living tree had become by the 7th century, a kind of barometer for an entire civilization's relationship to one night that had happened 1,000 years earlier. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. A separate tradition, recorded in the Sri Lankan chronicle known as the Mahavamsa, describes a cutting of this very tree, taken by most accounts not long after Ashoka's conversion, being carried across the sea to Sri Lanka and planted there, a city called Anuradhapura. That tree, called the Sri Mahabodhi, is still alive today. Botanists and historians widely consider it the oldest continuously documented, deliberately planted tree on Earth, with an unbroken historical record stretching back more than 2,000 years. A living, breathing, still growing direct descendant of the exact tree one starving, exhausted man sat beneath on one particular night, refusing to get up until he understood. The chronicle credits this particular transplant to Ashoka's own daughter, a nun named Sangamata, who is recorded as carrying the sapling across the sea personally, accompanying it the entire journey, as though escorting something closer to a living relative than simple cargo. Sri Lankan tradition has maintained with remarkable continuity living record of care for this single tree across the centuries since. Terraced platforms built to protect its roots, guardians appointed across generations specifically to watch over it. A chain of attention passed down so consistently that modern botanists studying the tree have been able to document its age with a level of confidence almost unheard of for any other living organism on the planet. There are older trees in the world in the sense of pure biological age. There may be none with this complete and unbroken a record connecting a specific living organism today to a specific recorded planting on a specific date, traced back to a specific cutting of a specific tree where one specific man once sat all night refusing to stand up. Centuries later, people are still standing exactly where this happened. Not metaphorically, literally. You could, with enough time and money for the journey, fly to Bodh Gaya in the Indian state of Bihar right now, stand under a tree grown from cuttings of the exact tree Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath that night. The same river nearby, lower and quieter now after 2,500 years of monsoons and dry seasons, but still the Niranjana, still running roughly the same course it ran the night. A golden bowl floated upstream against everything water is supposed to do. The site today bears almost no resemblance to the quiet forest clearing it would have been on that particular evening. Where there was once a single fig tree on an unmarked riverbank, there now stands the Mahabodhi temple complex, a soaring structure rebuilt and renovated across multiple centuries, recognized by global heritage organizations as one of the most significant religious sites on Earth, drawing pilgrims and visitors from virtually every country with a Buddhist community and many without one. Monks in robes from traditions as different from each other as Sri Lankan Theravada, Tibetan Vajrayana, and Japanese Zen can be found there on any given day, often within sights of each other, performing practices shaped by wildly different centuries and cultures, guided by nothing more and nothing less than the shared conviction that something genuinely happened in this exact place that changed what it was possible for a human mind to understand. Pilgrims circle the tree the way Siddhartha himself is said to have circled it during one of the 7 weeks immediately following his awakening. Many sit beneath it in silence for as long as they're permitted to stay, doing miniature on an afternoon visit measured in hours rather than an entire night, some small echo of the exact thing he did there at much greater length and much greater cost. This is not a story about a god descending to fix a broken world the way we told you at the very start of this video. This is not a story that ended that night under the tree, when the last fermentation finally dissolved at dawn. This is not a story that ended at Sarnath, when 5 skeptical men became the first 5 members of something that would eventually call itself a Sangha. This is not even a story that ended when the man at the center of it died, decades later, by a riverbank near Kusinara, with an old attendant named Ananda kneeling beside him, finally asking the one question he'd swallowed for almost half a century. This is a story that has not ended yet, because somewhere, right now on the other side of the world from wherever you happen to be watching this, there is a tree, alive, still growing, still rooted in soil that remembers exactly what happened there. And here is the part worth sitting with longest before we close this chapter. Not the history, not the botany, not even the staggering improbability of a single living organism connecting you right now, this directly, to one specific night 2,500 years ago. Think instead about your own version of that tree, not a fig tree, and not anything you could photograph or visit. The specific moment in your own life, and almost everyone watching this has one, even if you've never put words to it before, when you finally stopped running from something. Not a dramatic, cinematic moment, necessarily. Maybe just a quiet Tuesday when you finally opened the letter you'd been avoiding, or finally said the hard thing out loud to the person who needed to hear it, or simply sat for the first time in longer than you'd like to admit with a feeling you'd spent years outrunning, and discovered, the way he discovered, that it didn't actually destroy you to finally look at it directly. You don't need 49 days of fasting to have a night like that. You don't need an army of fear made visible in the dark, or 3 knowledges, or a fig tree by a particular river in northern India. You need, it turns out, something much smaller and much more available than any of that. The willingness for one night or 1 hour or even just the next 10 minutes to stop getting up every time something difficult surfaces and instead simply stay, look, and let it finish saying whatever it came to say. Think about how often the opposite has been the default in your own life without you ever quite framing it that way. Notification check the instant a difficult thought begins to surface. The errand suddenly remembered the moment a hard conversation threatens to start on. The show queued up specifically because the alternative, an empty evening with nothing to distract from whatever's been sitting quietly underneath the noise of an ordinary day, feels, for reasons that rarely get looked at directly, slightly unbearable. None of that makes you weak or unusual, or somehow worse than the man under the tree. It makes you human, living inside the same basic architecture of avoidance every other human being on earth has had to find their own way through, with or without a 6-year search and a fig tree to show for it. What this story offers, if it offers anything practical at all beyond its own considerable beauty, is simply the proof that the avoidance can be interrupted, not permanently, not perfectly, not in a single triumphant evening, but interrupted enough, often enough, to discover that the things you've been running from were never quite as dangerous standing still in front of as they were chasing you from behind. And that willingness is the entire story you've just spent this whole video walking through, distilled down to its smallest, most repeatable size. Everything else, the daughters, the army, the river, the earth, the chain with no first link, was simply what staying actually looked like for one specific man on one specific night looked at this closely for the first time in your life. And if this story has meant something to you, if some part of it landed in a place you weren't quite expecting, that's exactly what this channel exists to do, and subscribing helps more people find their way to stories told this carefully, instead of the rushed, surface-level versions most of the internet settles for. And here, before we move into the final chapter, is the question worth carrying with you longer than almost anything else in this video. What is the one thing right now in your own life that you've been getting up and walking away from? And every single time it surfaces. And what do you think might actually happen if just once you didn't? There's one last image worth leaving you with before we close this out completely. Not from the night itself, but from a conversation that happened centuries later between a monk named Nagasena and a king named Milinda, recorded in a text called the Milinda Panya. The king asks the monk a question that sounds almost like a trick. Is the self that exists now the same self that existed in childhood, or a different one entirely? Nagasena answers with an image instead of a direct answer. He points to the king's chariot and asks him to find the chariot itself, separate from its wheels, its axle, its frame, its reins. The king searches and can't do it. There is no chariot apart from the parts arranged together, working in relationship, for as long as they hold their arrangement. That's not a trick answer. It's the whole night you've just spent these 14 chapters walking through, compressed into a single image. The man who sat down under that fig tree was not the same, in any fixed, unchanging sense, as the man who stood up from it at dawn. And yet there was never a moment where one self stopped and another separate self began. There was simply a long night of watching, closely enough and patiently enough, held the very idea of a fixed, defended self needing to be protected from every fear that arose finally had nowhere left to stand. It's worth noticing, too, that Nagasena's chariot is not a story about absence. A chariot is not nothing simply because it can't be found as some separate, additional thing beyond its parts. It still carries the king. It still rolls down the road. It still does everything a chariot is supposed to do, exactly as well as it did before anyone asked the question. The same, the tradition suggests, is true of the man who woke at dawn beneath the fig tree. Nothing about him stopped functioning. He still walked 200 miles. He still recognized old friends, still felt grief at the death of 2 teachers who never quite made it across the finish line, still spoke with warmth to a woman who had given him rice that morning and a frightened servant who mistook him for a spirit. What changed was not his capacity to live a full human life. What changed was the absence of a frightened, defended center at the middle of that life, fighting constantly to protect itself from every wind that blew against it. That's the whole story, really, not a man becoming someone else, and a man finally seeing clearly enough that the self he'd spent his whole life, and, by his own account, countless lives before this one, defending so fiercely was never quite the solid thing fear kept insisting it was. So here, before we go, are 3 things worth carrying with you. First, a simple truth about what actually happened that night. Awakening was not a single instant of grace arriving from somewhere outside him. It was a structured, demanding, watch-by-watch process. Temptation met without flinching, fear met and seen through, knowledge built on knowledge. The last and quietest fermentation engine, dissolved only after the loudest ones had already been faced. Patience, not lightning. That's the truth the story itself insists on. However many gold-lit paintings have tried to compress it into a single, dramatic flash, it's worth carrying the actual shape of that night with you, specifically, rather than the flattened version most retellings settle for. An evening meal from a kind stranger, a vow made in private with no audience and no guarantee of success. A temptation dressed as wisdom, refused before it could even be recognized as a temptation. An army of every fear a person could name, met without moving. A hand reaching down to touch the ground when no other witness could be found. Hours of patient looking backward through everything that had ever happened to him, and hours more of looking outward at what was happening, simultaneously, to everyone else. No, a chain traced link by link until it revealed itself as having no beginning at all. And then, last and quietest of everything that came before it, the simple refusal to call 90% finished close enough. That is the actual architecture underneath the single word awakening, far less photogenic than a halo, and far more useful as a map for an ordinary life. Second, what that truth actually implies for you. The things that visit you in your own stillest, darkest hours, the 2 a.m. dread, the thought you've been out running all day that finally catches you the second you stop moving, are not enemies you need to defeat in some heroic battle. They are old, familiar guests, not dressed up to look more dangerous than they actually are. The way Māra's army looked like monsters from the outside, while underneath, every single division of it was simply fear, doubt, boredom, and craving wearing borrowed armor. You don't have to win a war against them. You have to do the much harder, much quieter thing. Stay still long enough to see them clearly enough that they run out of reasons to keep visiting. This is in its own way most immediately usable piece of the entire night, the part that doesn't require 6 years of searching or a fig tree by a particular river to begin practicing in some small form. Next time, something difficult surfaces in a quiet moment. Not a crisis, necessarily, just an ordinary evening with nothing left to distract you from it. Notice the impulse to reach for the phone, the show, the errand, a conversation that conveniently needs to happen right now. And then, just once, just for a few minutes longer than feels comfortable, don't. Not as a grand act of willpower, not as a dramatic confrontation, but simply as a small, repeatable experiment in finding out what's actually there, underneath the urge to look away. That is the whole night scaled down to a size an ordinary evening can actually hold. Third, and this is the one to actually sit with tonight after you close this video. Somewhere on the other side of the world right now, in a small city in the Indian state of Bihar, there is a tree. It is alive. It is growing. Its roots remember in whatever way roots remember anything. A night when one exhausted, starving man refused to get up before he was finished. And that refusal turned out to be strong enough to outlast every empire that has risen and fallen in the 2,500 years since. You do not need a tree like that, and you do not need a river or a forest or 49 days or even one whole night. You need exactly what he had in its smallest and most available form. The willingness, the next time something difficult surfaces in the quiet, to simply stay a little longer than you normally would, and find out, the way he found out, what's actually on the other side of staying. There is something quietly remarkable in the fact that a tree, of all things, ended up carrying this story forward more reliably than any single human institution managed to. Empires that rose around it crumbled. Languages that first told this story changed beyond recognition or disappeared from daily use entirely. And the tree, through all of it, simply kept doing what trees do, growing, dropping seed and cutting, being carried elsewhere and replanted, quietly outlasting every more dramatic vehicle history offered for carrying a single night's understanding forward across 25 centuries. Maybe that's its own small lesson, sitting underneath everything else this story has tried to give you. The things that actually last are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They are usually the patient ones, putting down roots one quiet season at a time, long after the more dramatic events around them have already passed into history. If any single moment in this story stayed with you more than the others, the army, the bowl on the river, the unexplained face, a chain with no first link, Kondanya's understanding, or the tree still standing right now, on the other side of the world from you, tell me which one and why in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd genuinely love to know which part of this very long night found its way into you. The man who sat down that evening exhausted and out of strategies, and the man who stood up from that same seat at dawn, ever two separate people. But something that night was finally completely peacefully finished.